Chapter 9. A Titan rises across the vast canvas of the cosmos. Time moved forward with deceptive calm after Yondu's funeral, the Milano drifting through silent nebulae and forgotten star corridors as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. But peace, for souls forged in loss and redemption, is not a static destination. It is a brief harbor before destiny, and as the guardians of the galaxy carried their grief forward, they were unaware that an ancient storm had already begun gathering beyond the edges of charted space, a storm wearing a crown of inevitability and a gauntlet waiting to be filled. Peter Quill sat often in the pilot's chair with music low and thoughts loud, his hand drifting to the Zune gifted to him after the Walkman's destruction, a symbol of change, of moving from a world defined by a mother's love and an outlaw father's sacrifice into uncertain territory, where adulthood meant carrying wounds without letting them define you. The crew sensed the shift as time settled into routine. Gamora, hardened yet softened in equal measure, trained with a quiet intensity, not because she feared enemies, but because she feared losing again those she had learned to love. Her steps in the ship's corridors no longer echoed loneliness. They mirrored watchfulness, a heart finally allowed to feel but terrified of how fragile connection truly was. Drax sat in stillness more than before, laughter echoing at times, but beneath it lay a contemplative peace born from witnessing sacrifice and understanding that strength was not measured by the absence of pain, but by surviving it. Rocket tinkered endlessly, hands restless, mind racing faster than his tools could keep up, building, destroying, rebuilding, not because projects needed completion, but because silence was too raw and grief too close behind him. Every small gadget he made for Groot, every adjustment he performed on the Milano, every snarl and sarcastic jab masked a heart that finally dared to trust and now feared the consequence. Groot, no longer infant but adolescent, wore rebellion like branches, aloof, stubborn, absorbed in handheld devices, yet watching everyone with a quiet love he did not know how to express. He grew slowly, painfully, learning not just language but loyalty, shaped by sacrifice he did not yet remember but felt in the roots of his being. And Nebula, who had left after Yondu's death not out of abandonment but out of purpose, to pursue the final ghost binding her to her past, moved across the galaxy like a blade honed not for vengeance alone but for liberation, driven by one mission, to kill Thanos, not simply to avenge herself or Gamora, but to end the cycle of torment he represented for countless children like them. And while the Guardians navigated their new emotional terrain, destiny stirred. The first tremors of Thanos' ascension were felt not through battle, but through whispers. Ravager bars buzzing with rumors of worlds gone silent, Nova patrols reporting missing fleets, distress calls cut off mid-scream. The Sovereign, once a looming threat, faded into irrelevance as forces greater than gold-plated armadas moved in shadows older than empires. Yet to the Guardians, life continued with the peculiar mixture of danger and absurdity that had always defined them, helping strange species in stranger places, arguing about snacks and chores, drifting between purpose and chaos. They accepted a contract from the Sovereign, not of loyalty but of reluctant professionalism, to retrieve an obelisk consuming their precious batteries, and though they succeeded, Rocket's theft reignited conflict, demonstrating that even newfound maturity could not erase old instincts overnight. But fate, impatient and relentless, intervened not through violence, but through celestial tragedy when a golden fleet pursued them, leading to the crash on Berhurt and the re-entry of Ego into their lives. A chapter now closed by Yondu's sacrifice and Ego's destruction, leaving only aftermath for them to carry. When they left Berhurt, reformed and redefined. They journeyed onward with a new sense of identity. No longer thieves who stumbled into heroism, but protectors of each other, guardians not only in name but in purpose. Yet purpose is often clearest when danger reveals it. As they drifted through space, a distress signal pierced their path. A massive ship drifting lifeless, metal torn open like flesh beneath claws of cosmic power. The Asgardian Ark floated cold and broken, body scattered, hope extinguished, and within that carnage stood the harbinger of doom. Thanos had begun. But the Guardians did not witness the slaughter firsthand. All they found was Thor's unconscious body, colliding with their windshield like divine wreckage thrown from Destiny's battlefield. Peter, Gamora, Rocket, Drax, and Groot dragged him aboard, stunned not by his divinity. They had faced gods, egoistic and literal, but by the sheer scale of destruction he carried in his silence. Thor awoke not with arrogance but with grief, voice heavy, breath cracked, speaking of loss and war, with a weight none of them had seen in him before. He spoke of Thanos, of the stones, of death, coming not as inevitability but as hunger. The Guardians listened, Gamora most of all, her face draining of color when Thor uttered the name she had spent a lifetime fearing. Thanos was not myth to her. He was father and torturer, shaper of her nightmares and architect of her childhood. Peter watched her reaction, understanding for the first time not just the strength she carried, but the terror she endured. The moment Thor named the Soul Stone, Gamora's heart seized, because she held a truth she had never voiced. She knew where it was, and in that revelation lay a new fracture. The Guardians split, Thor, Rocket, and Groot heading toward Nidavellir to forge a weapon that could kill a Titan, while Peter, Gamora, Drax, and Mantis traveled toward nowhere to stop Thanos from acquiring the Reality Stone. And as the ship hummed toward fate, Gamora made Peter promise something no lover, no friend, no warrior should ever ask. If Thanos captured her, if he tried to take from her what he had placed inside her through torment and training, Peter must kill her, not because she wished to die, but because she understood that Thanos' victory would not merely end worlds, it would obliterate free will itself. Peter promised, voice trembling, heartbreaking, because loving someone sometimes means choosing their dignity over your hope. The promise hung between them like fragile starlight, and when Peter kissed her, it was not passion, but desperation. Two souls clinging to the illusion that love could halt destiny. But destiny does not bend to love. It tests it. On nowhere they walked into illusion, reality warped by the reality. Stone Thanos had already claimed, and Gamora confronted him with strength, neither warrior nor child, but both demanding truth, demanding release, demanding end. And when Thanos took her, Drax roared, Peter's hand shook, and the universe held its breath. Peter aimed at the woman he loved, pulled the trigger as she asked, fulfilling his promise. But bubbles poured from his gun, and the sound of Thanos' laughter cut deeper than any blade. Thanos vanished with Gamora, leaving Peter broken, not by failure, but by the knowledge that he had been willing to do the unimaginable, that love had demanded sacrifice only for fate to mock him. Loss returned not as echo, but as avalanche. On Vormir, Gamora died not as assassin, not as daughter, not as warrior, but as child pleading for freedom, thrown from a cliff by the father who claimed affection while committing annihilation. She did not die believing in destiny, she died defying it, screaming truth, that love without choice is not love, it is enslavement. And in her death, the Soul Stone awakened. The Guardians, unaware in that moment of her fate, continued into war fragmented, grieving, desperate. Rocket forged a weapon with Thor while hiding a trembling fear beneath jokes. Groot, in a moment of adolescent defiance, turned heroism, sacrificed his own arm to form Stormbreaker's handle, learning perhaps too early that family means giving parts of yourself away. Drax and Mantis fought on Titan, not as unstoppable warriors, but as wounded souls refusing to bow, and Peter, broken, reeling, confronted Thanos not as outlaw or hero, but as man who lost the person who made him believe he could be better. His grief exploded into rage, and his fist sealed fate, not because he was weak, but because he was human, and humans break when love is torn away. When the snap came, when the universe dissolved into ash and Peter faded with whispered apology in his eyes, it was not defeat. It was the shattering of innocence, the collapse of hope built on fragile unity. Rocket watched his family crumble into dust, Groot whispering, "I am Groot," not defiant, but terrified. And Rocket's scream was not pain, but abandonment all over again. Yet even in devastation, seeds remain. Nebula, once child of hate, stayed at Tony Stark's side when all others vanished. Proof that the cycle Thanos began had already been broken by Gamora's love and the Guardians' defiance. The galaxy fell into silence, half extinguished, half grieving, and among survivors drifted the remnants of the most unlikely family space had ever known, scattered, wounded, but not defeated. For in the wake of catastrophe, a truth lingered stronger than any infinity stone. That found family endures not because fate demands it, but because souls who choose each other do not surrender to the universe. They rebuild it. And as stars glimmered cold and solemn above the ashes of half of life, one truth became clear. A Titan had risen, but so too had the Guardians' resolve, forged in loss, waiting for the moment destiny would offer them a second chance to fight not for galaxies but for each other. Chapter 10: Love and Loss at the Edge of the Universe. There are wounds so vast they cannot be seen, only felt in the hollow space left behind. And when Thanos snapped his fingers and half of existence dissolved into dust, the universe did not scream, it exhaled quietly as if exhausted by its own suffering. For the guardians of the galaxy who had risen from fragments of trauma to build a family from misfits and pain, this moment was not the end. It was a shattering, a violent unmaking, not of bodies alone, but of identity, purpose, and hope. The battle on Titan did not end in heroism or sacrifice, but in helplessness. As Peter Quill, once boy grieving on Earth, once man learning to love in the stars, fell apart in front of the creature who stole everything from him, unable to breathe through grief born of Gamora's death. And when the ashes drifted from Drax's fingertips, when Mantis gasped and disappeared, when Groot whispered his final frightened "I am Groot" to Rocket, the galaxy learned that even the strongest bonds can crumble beneath cosmic cruelty. Peter faded last among his team, his voice trembling as he whispered that he didn't feel well, and in those final seconds his bravado peeled away, leaving only the vulnerability of a boy who had already lost a mother, lost a father, and now faced oblivion without the woman he loved, not with defiance, but with fear. There was no music in that moment, no charm, no quip, only the raw truth that love makes loss unbearable, and the universe does not pause to acknowledge a heartbreak, even when it is profound enough to break a star. Rocket watched, powerless, as his family turned to dust one by one. And in that instant he was no longer the hardened mercenary or brilliant engineer or sarcastic shield against pain. He was the trembling experiment again, the lonely creature in a cage, left without anyone to hold on to. The Milano felt too big, space felt too silent, and the weight of survival pressed down like a punishment, not a mercy. He had spent years refusing to admit he cared, pushing everyone away before they could leave him. But the Guardians had stayed anyway, and now they were gone. not by choice, not by betrayal, but by fate so cruel it almost felt personal. In Rocket's shaking breath lay the tragedy of growth, that learning to love had made him vulnerable to the very thing he feared most, losing the ones who made him feel worth loving in the first place. And Nebula, standing beside him, felt something she had spent her life believing she did not deserve. Belonging, fractured but still present. She had fought her sister for so long, and only recently learned that Gamora's rivalry had always hidden longing, that beneath hatred had been the hope of family. And now Gamora was gone, stolen not by Thanos' cruelty of the past, but by his cruelty of the present. Nebula sat beside Tony Stark on a broken ship, drifting through space, sharpening her blade and quietly learning the language of companionship, not through words, but through shared failure, shared exhaustion, shared grief. When she placed a hand on his shoulder and guided his pieces in a simple game, it was not strategy, it was mourning, wearing the mask of distraction, a small gesture, acknowledging that in loss, even enemies can sit together without violence. And then came silence, a silence stretching across galaxies, across abandoned worlds, across empty star systems where laughter once lived. The Guardians' colors dimmed, their humor faded, their ship now a vessel of memories rather than momentum. Rocket and Nebula returned to Earth, a world Peter once fled, a world he now yearned unknowingly to return to, and they found not comfort but the shattered remnants of other heroes caught in the same wave of grief. Avengers headquarters became a refuge not of warriors strategizing, but of survivors breathing through trauma. Rocket stood among gods and soldiers, unthreatened by their power, yet deeply threatened by their hope, because he feared hope meant risking heartbreak again. Nebula, for the first time in her life, found herself among people who treated her pain not as weakness, but as something sacred, not to be mocked, but to be held in quiet respect. She had spent her life fighting to prove she was more than Thanos' pawn, and now those who once would have hunted her instead fought beside her, not because they trusted her completely, but because they understood her, and that was enough. The years following the snap were not defined by heroism but by survival. Rocket became something he never expected, a protector not of prophets but of planets, traveling with Carol Danvers and others to aid ravaged civilizations, his sarcasm thinning into humility, responsibility settling into his bones like gravity long avoided. He who once mocked sentiment now carried it reluctantly, angrily, but honestly, because grief had reshaped him. Nebula became something even more unexpected, gentle in moments, reflective, a warrior unlearning cruelty, trying to rebuild something resembling identity not built around pain. When she sat alone aboard ships or gazed at the stars, she no longer saw battlegrounds. She saw fragments of freedom, possibilities born because she survived, because Gamora once believed she could be more. And through 5 long years, Rocket and Nebula became family, not loud or joyful like before, but steady, solid, the quiet kind of love built by shared loss and endurance. They checked each other for damage when returning from missions. They argued about food rations and ship maintenance. They sat in silence when memories hurt too much to speak. They did not replace what was lost. Nothing could not, but they built something new from the ashes. Then, hope returned in the most unexpected form. Not a cosmic prophecy or heroic proclamation, but Scott Lang banging desperately on a storage unit door and stumbling into headquarters with wild eyes and impossible news. The quantum realm could undo what had been done. Hope did not announce itself in triumph. It entered shaking, confused, disoriented, much like the Guardians themselves when they first learned how to belong. And with that spark, the universe shifted. Plans were formed, alliances reforged, and the impossible became a mission. Rocket and Nebula who once acted only in self-interest, now stood at strategy tables beside Earth's mightiest heroes, not as outsiders, but as equals. When the time heist began, Rocket's quips hid fear, but also determination. He would not lose his family again. Nebula, stepping into the past and confronting her former self, faced one of the hardest truths any survivor can face, that the person she used to be had to die so the person she had become could live. Her battle with her younger self was not simply combat, it was symbolic. A literal fight between trauma and healing, between vengeance and growth, between chains of the past and the fragile wings of transformation. And when the dust settled, when Hulk snapped and life returned like air rushing into lungs starved too long, the Guardians returned not in triumph but in relief. Drax roaring joyfully into battle, Mantis blinking in confusion, Groot sprouting from ash once more, and Peter Quill emerging on Titan, seeing Gamora, but not his Gamora. This Gamora, from a timeline untouched by love, looked at him with unfamiliar eyes, seeing not partner, not friend, not soul, bound through trauma and tenderness, but stranger. Peter's joy dissolved into heartbreak so complex, it defied expression. The woman he died loving stood before him, but knew nothing of their shared scars, shared laughter, shared growth. Love returned not as gift, but as challenge, reminding him that destiny never restores what it breaks. It offers new roads and demands courage to walk them. The battle against Thanos' forces raged, and the Guardians fought not as misfits but as legends, Rocket firing through tears, Groot shielding allies once again, Drax cutting through armies with vengeance tempered by purpose, Mantis calming horrors beyond comprehension, Nebula refusing the chains of her past by helping the woman she once hated escape the fate she once shared. And when Tony Stark sacrificed himself, dusting Thanos and his army into history, Rocket collapsed in grief, clutching Groot, the universe once again reminding him that love does not protect against loss, it amplifies it. Yet this time he did not grieve alone. Nebula knelt beside him, Gamora walked away into the unknown, and Peter stood staring at a future where love had no guarantees. When the war ended, when the ashes settled and the galaxy exhaled again, the Guardians were reborn, not in joy, not in certainty, but in resilience. They set off once more into the stars, not because they knew where they were going, but because moving forward was the only way to keep breathing. Peter, quieter now, carried hope like a fragile ember, searching for the version of Gamora he lost, yet learning to accept that love cannot be forced, that people must choose each other again, freely. Rocket, now captain of the Milano while Peter found himself, carried pride hidden behind sarcasm and grief hidden behind duty. Nebula returned with them, not as outsider but sister. Groot grew once more. Drax still heard but laughed louder. Mantis found strength in gentleness. And though Gamora was gone, some version of her breathed somewhere in the galaxy, reminding Peter that love does not die. It transforms, evolves, waits. The blip did not break the Guardians. It hardened them, deepened them, revealed that family forged in chaos can endure even the undoing of the universe. They learned love does not prevent loss but makes surviving it possible. They learned destiny can tear apart what trauma once united, but healing can rebuild even after cosmic devastation. And in the quiet hum of the Milano leaving Earth, a new truth settled into them like starlight into skin. The galaxy may rise and fall around them, but as long as they chose each other, again and again, even in grief, they would never be lost. Chapter 10: Love and Loss at the Edge of the Universe. There are wounds so vast they cannot be seen, only felt in the hollow space left behind. And when Thanos snapped his fingers and half of existence dissolved into dust, the universe did not scream, it exhaled quietly, as if exhausted by its own suffering. For the Guardians of the Galaxy who had risen from fragments of trauma to build a family from misfits and pain, this moment wasn't the end. It was a shattering, a violent unmaking not of bodies alone, but of identity, purpose, and hope. The battle on Titan did not end in heroism or sacrifice, but in helplessness. As Peter Quill, once boy grieving on Earth, once man learning to love in the stars, fell apart in front of the creature who stole everything from him, unable to breathe through grief born of Gamora's death. And when the ashes drifted from Drax's fingertips, when Mantis gasped and disappeared, when Groot whispered his final frightened, "I am Groot!" to Rocket, the galaxy learned that even the strongest bonds can crumble beneath cosmic cruelty. Peter faded last among his team, his voice trembling as he whispered that he didn't feel well, and in those final seconds his bravado peeled away, leaving only the vulnerability of a boy who had already lost a mother, lost a father, and now faced oblivion without the woman he loved. Not with defiance, but with fear. There was no music in that moment, no charm, no quip, only the raw truth that love makes loss unbearable, and the universe does not pause to acknowledge heartbreak, even when it is profound enough to break a star. Rocket watched, powerless, as his family turned to dust one by one, and in that instant he was no longer the hardened mercenary or brilliant engineer or sarcastic shield against pain. He was the trembling experiment again, the lonely creature in a cage, left without anyone to hold on to. The Milano felt too big, space felt too silent, and the weight of survival pressed down like a punishment, not a mercy. He had spent years refusing to admit he cared, pushing everyone away before they could leave him. But the Guardians had stayed anyway, and now they were gone, not by choice, not by betrayal, but by fate so cruel it almost felt personal. In Rocket's shaking breath lay the tragedy of growth, that learning to love had made him vulnerable to the very thing he feared most, losing the ones who made him feel worth loving in the first place. And Nebula, standing beside him, felt something she had spent her life believing she did not deserve. Belonging, fractured, but still present. She had fought her sister for so long and only recently learned that Gamora's rivalry had always hidden longing, that beneath hatred had been the hope of family. And now Gamora was gone, stolen not by Thanos' cruelty of the past, but by his cruelty of the present. Nebula sat beside Tony Stark on a broken ship, drifting through space, sharpening her blade and quietly, learning the language of companionship, not through words, but through shared failure, shared exhaustion, shared grief. When she placed a hand on his shoulder and guided his pieces in a simple game, it was not strategy. It was mourning, wearing the mask of distraction, a small gesture acknowledging that in loss, even enemies can sit together without violence. And then came silence, a silence stretching across galaxies, across abandoned worlds, across empty star systems where laughter once lived. The Guardians' colors dimmed, their humor faded, their ship now a vessel of memories rather than momentum. Rocket and Nebula returned to Earth, a world Peter once fled, a world he now yearned unknowingly to return to. And they found not comfort, but the shattered remnants of other heroes caught in the same wave of grief. Avengers Headquarters became a refuge not of warriors strategizing, but of survivors breathing through trauma. Rocket stood among gods and soldiers, unthreatened by their power, yet deeply threatened by their hope, because he feared hope meant risking heartbreak again. Nebula, for the first time in her life, found herself among people who treated her pain not as weakness, but as something sacred, not to be mocked, but to be held in quiet respect. She had spent her life fighting to prove she was more than Thanos' pawn. And now those who once would have hunted her instead fought beside her, not because they trusted her completely, but because they understood her. And that was enough. The years following the snap were not defined by heroism but by survival. Rocket became something he never expected, a protector not of prophets but of planets, traveling with Carol Danvers and others to aid ravaged civilizations, his sarcasm thinning into humility, responsibility settling into his bones like gravity long avoided. He who once mocked sentiment now carried it reluctantly, angrily, but honestly, because grief had reshaped him. Nebula became something even more unexpected, gentle in moments, reflective, a warrior unlearning cruelty, trying to rebuild something resembling identity, not built around pain. When she sat alone aboard ships or gazed at the stars, she no longer saw battlegrounds. She saw fragments of freedom, possibilities born because she survived, because Gamora once believed she could be more. And through 5 long years, Rocket and Nebula became family, not loud or joyful like before, but steady, solid, the quiet kind of love built by shared loss and endurance. They checked each other for damage when returning from missions. They argued about food rations and ship maintenance. They sat in silence when memories hurt too much to speak. They did not replace what was lost. Nothing could but they built something new from the ashes. Then, hope returned in the most unexpected form. Not a cosmic prophecy or heroic proclamation, but Scott Lang banging desperately on a storage unit door and stumbling into headquarters with wild eyes and impossible news. The quantum realm could undo what had been done. Hope did not announce itself in triumph. It entered shaking, confused, disoriented, much like the Guardians themselves when they first learned how to belong. And with that spark, the universe shifted. Plans were formed, alliances reforged, and the impossible became a mission. Rocket and Nebula, who once acted only in self-interest, now stood at strategy tables beside Earth's mightiest heroes, not as outsiders, but as equals. When the time heist began, Rocket's quips hid fear, but also determination. He would not lose his family again. Nebula, stepping into the past and confronting her former self, faced one of the hardest truths any survivor can face, that the person she used to be had to die so the person she had become could live. Her battle with her younger self was not simply combat. It was symbolic, a literal fight between trauma and healing, between vengeance and growth, between chains of the past and the fragile wings of transformation. And when the dust settled, when Hulk snapped and life returned like air rushing into lungs starved too long, the Guardians returned not in triumph but in relief. Drax roaring joyfully into battle, Mantis blinking in confusion, Groot sprouting from ash once more, and Peter Quill emerging on Titan, seeing Gamora but not his Gamora. This Gamora, from a timeline untouched by love, looked at him with unfamiliar eyes, seeing not partner, not friend, not soul, bound through trauma and tenderness, but stranger. Peter's joy dissolved into heartbreak so complex it defied expression. The woman he died loving stood before him but knew nothing of their shared scars, shared laughter, shared growth. Love returned not as gift but as challenge, reminding him that destiny never restores what it breaks. It offers new roads and demands courage to walk them. The battle against Thanos' forces raged, and the Guardians fought not as misfits but as legends, Rocket firing through tears, Groot shielding allies once again, Drax cutting through armies with vengeance tempered by purpose, Mantis calming horrors beyond comprehension, Nebula refusing the chains of her past by helping the woman she once hated escape the fate she once shared. And when Tony Stark sacrificed himself, dusting Thanos and his army into history, Rocket collapsed in grief, clutching Groot, the universe once again reminding him that love does not protect against loss, it amplifies it. Yet this time he did not grieve alone. Nebula knelt beside him, Gamora walked away into the unknown, and Peter stood staring at a future where love had no guarantees. When the war ended, when the ashes settled and the galaxy exhaled again, the Guardians were reborn. Not in joy, not in certainty, but in resilience. They set off once more into the stars, not because they knew where they were going, but because moving forward was the only way to keep breathing. Peter, quieter now, carried hope like a fragile ember, searching for the version of Gamora he lost, yet learning to accept that love cannot be forced, that people must choose each other again, freely. Rocket, now captain of the Milano while Peter found himself, carried pride hidden behind sarcasm and grief hidden behind duty. Nebula returned with them, not as outsider, but sister. Groot grew once more. Drax still hurt but laughed louder. Mantis found strength in gentleness. And though Gamora was gone, some version of her breathed somewhere in the galaxy, reminding Peter that love does not die. It transforms, evolves, waits. The blip did not break the Guardians. It hardened them, deepened them, revealed that family forged in chaos can endure even the undoing of the universe. They learn love does not prevent loss, but makes surviving it possible. They learn destiny can tear apart what trauma once united, but healing can rebuild even after cosmic devastation. And in the quiet hum of the Milano leaving Earth, a new truth settled into them, like starlight into skin. The galaxy may rise and fall around them, but as long as they chose each other, again and again, even in grief, they would never be lost. Chapter 11: Ashes and Silence. In the aftermath of cosmic war, when the echoes of fallen armies still clung to the stars and the universe struggled to understand how to breathe again, the Guardians of the Galaxy did not return with triumphant roars or victorious boasting. They drifted back into the cosmic quiet like wounded birds seeking branches strong enough to hold them, carrying grief like stardust in their lungs, each breath a reminder of what was lost and what could never be restored. The battle against Thanos had ended. Yes, his armies dissolved, his ambition turned to ash, but victory had never been the Guardian's destination. Survival had, and even that felt unfamiliar now. Peter Quill, once the loudest voice in any room, withdrew into a silence deeper than space itself, his eyes hollowed by the weight of a love torn from time, by the knowledge that the Gamora who returned was not the woman who chose him, not the partner who softened his sharp edges and steadied his restless heart. For Peter, losing her was not like losing someone to death. It was harsher, quieter, a wound that bled memory instead of blood. Somewhere in the galaxy she lived, breathed, fought, but she did not know him, did not remember the life they built in stolen moments between danger and laughter. And so, Peter sank not into rage, but into numbness, drifting through the corridors of the Bowie like a ghost, Walkman replaced by a Zune filled with songs he could not bear to play, because music, once sanctuary, now felt like a door he was too afraid to open. What if stepping through meant falling apart? Rocket, now captain in action if not in title, bore responsibility like a scar across his heart, grumbling orders and keeping engines running and snapping at anyone who dared to offer comfort, because caring openly still felt like standing unarmored in a battlefield. He had lost the closest thing he ever had to a father in Yondu, and then lost his family to dust, and then regained them only to lose Tony Stark in a blaze of sacrificial love. Rocket understood sacrifice, understood loneliness, but he did not know yet how to live in a universe that suddenly offered room to feel. So, he worked, he fixed, he upgraded, he patrolled galaxies for threats that no longer came, because quiet frightened him more than conflict ever did. And yet, Beneath the sarcasm and circuitry, his eyes softened when he looked at his crew, at Groot, who grew from sapling into lanky teenager rebelling against commands with rolled eyes made of wood, at Mantis, whose innocent wonder never dimmed even after witnessing gods die, at Drax, whose grief still echoed in his laughter, at Nebula, hardened steel learning to bend. Nebula especially had become something unexpected, not merely ally, not simply warrior, but glue. She moved through the ship repairing systems and repairing hearts with equal commitment, not through warmth. She was not built for softness, but through consistency, through presence, through unspoken promise. I am here and I will not leave. After the war, Nebula and Rocket spent weeks alone, wandering debris fields and abandoned star routes, picking up scattered remnants of ships, helping worlds too broken to ask, returning stolen children to parents who never expected reunion. Nebula learned to sit without sharpening a blade, to exist without anticipating pain, to speak without venom, and sometimes, late at night, when stars glimmered like scars across black sky, she would whisper Gamora's name, not with anger but longing. She wanted a sister, and found herself grieving not one, but two, the Gamora she lost, and the version in the shadows somewhere, lost to her own identity. When the Guardians reunited fully, with Thor joining them briefly, his booming voice and heavy heart clashing humorously with their rhythm, Nebula did not laugh at his jokes or flinch at his presence. She simply breathed around him, a strange peace earned through surviving herself as much as surviving war. They drifted. They worked odd missions. They argued, laughed, sulked. They saved small towns, escorted refugees, chased petty space criminals who had never heard of Thanos because their worlds were too small to feel cosmic dread. And slowly, painfully, life returned in fragments. Drax taught children on remote planets to fight imaginary monsters, roaring proudly as they swung sticks twice their size. Mantis collected small souvenirs from every world, flowers, shells, tiny glowing stones, gifting them to her family with shy pride. Groot tested his growing abilities, sometimes sprouting massive roots accidentally during naps, sometimes forming tiny flowers to cheer Rocket up. And Peter sat, not always in silence. Sometimes he stared at holoscreens, searching for Gamora's face in bounty records and border logs. Sometimes he sat in the pilot seat, not to fly but to feel capable of flying, because purpose mattered as much as action. Sometimes he held the Zune, thumb hovering over play, and sometimes, just sometimes, he pressed the button and let music bleed into the ship. Songs drifted through the air like ghosts, familiar chords carrying memories of dances, jokes, battles, kisses. Every playlist was a graveyard, but also a path forward. The galaxy did not ask them to save it now. It asked them only to exist. And existence for the Guardians was work. Healing is battle. Comfort is unfamiliar. Stillness feels like danger. So, when the holiday season approached on Earth, a tradition Peter hadn't fully embraced since childhood, Mantis decided something radical. Peter needed joy. Not solitude, not responsibility, but messy, vibrant, chaotic joy. And so began a mission both absurd and sacred, the hunt to steal Kevin Bacon. To many across the universe, such a mission would seem idiotic, pointless, ridiculous. To Mantis and Drax, it made perfect emotional logic. Peter had lost. Gamora lost the universe, lost pieces of himself, and Earth was where joy once lived for him. So they went, stumbling through Los Angeles with alien innocence, confusing tourists, hugging strangers, misunderstanding life on a planet that turned grief into holiday lights. The mission was comedy painted over sorrow. Drax wanted a funny little man. Mantis wanted her brother to smile, even once. Peter, when presented with the absurd gift of Kevin Bacon wrapped in twinkling lights, reacted not with laughter at first, but with shock, because kindness, unexpected and unasked for, can feel like pain before it feels like comfort. But when music filled nowhere, when lights brightened the cold metallic outpost they now called home, when Mantis told him the truth, that she was his sister, Peter's heart cracked open not from grief but warmth. Found family had given him purpose, discovered that that family gave him roots. For the first time since the battle, he smiled not as mask or memory, but as man remembering how. Life on Nowhere became their next chapter. They rebuilt it from ruins, turning a severed celestial head into sanctuary, a home for refugees, for travelers, for beings lost between stars. Peter took leadership gently, reluctantly, but steadily. Rocket enforced rules with poorly disguised affection. Nebula installed streetlights because children tripped in the dark. Drax helped raise alien youngsters, laughing when they climbed him like a tree. Mantis made decorations. Groot grew wreaths from his branches. Music drifted from speakers permanently fixed to the town square. And though Gamora's absence still ached in Peter's chest like phantom limb, he began to live again, not because the pain faded, but because he learned it could coexist with love. Yet under all this, peace, light, purpose, something darker brewed inside Rocket. A name whispered from his past, in a corporation that treated life as property. Monster wearing a god complex worse than egos. Not celestial, but human in the worst way. The high evolutionary. Rocket's nightmares grew. His restlessness sharpened. The past he never shared surfaced not through confession, but through silence heavy enough for his family to notice. And they would need every fragment of strength, every scar, every laugh earned through suffering for what would come next. Because healing is not linear, redemption does not erase trauma, and family, no matter how strong, must sometimes break again to rebuild stronger. When danger returned, not cosmic like Thanos, but intimate like old wounds, it would strike through Rocket first, pulling the Guardians into their most personal war yet. But before that storm came the quiet, fragile, hopeful, imperfect, a season where found family learned how to stay not just in battle, but in life. It was here, in the quiet breaths between galaxies, that they discovered a truth more powerful than destiny. That strength is not found in saving worlds, but in choosing to stay with the ones who saved you, again and again, even when the universe forgets you. Loss had shaped them, love would carry them. The ashes had settled, and though silence remained, it no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like preparation, like soil before spring, ready to bloom again. Chapter 12: Endgame and the Search for What Was Lost. Even after the universe was restored, after the dust reformed into lives and the dead returned gasping into existence, the Guardians of the Galaxy did not emerge victorious and whole. They returned scarred, rearranged, held together not by triumph but by stubborn hope and the gravity of bonds forged in trauma. And as the galaxy celebrated salvation, Peter Quill stood adrift between miracles and ghosts, searching not for glory, but for the woman who once anchored him to himself. The Gamora who returned in the wake of Endgame was not his Gamora, not the one who learned to smile because he cracked jokes and played old Earth songs, not the woman who touched his face in moments quiet enough to heal wounds carved by childhood abandonment, not the partner who softened her assassin's edges to become something almost gentle. Instead, she was a warrior plucked from the past, hardened by a lifetime of servitude to Thanos, and not yet softened by friendship, love, or found family. Peter confronted her on the battlefield, breath stolen by the shock of seeing her alive, heart racing with the desperate hope that love might transcend time. But love, real love, cannot be inherited, cannot be demanded from a version of someone who never lived it. Gamora looked at Peter with confusion, irritation, a flicker of pity, and a wall built of years she had not yet lived, and his heart, already fragile from loss, cracked further under the realization that destiny had given him a cruel gift, the body of the woman he loved, and none of the memories that made her his. She left him in that moment, returning to the Ravagers, choosing freedom over attachment, autonomy over fate, and though Peter did not falter, because once, long ago, he too ran from anything that threatened to anchor him, it did not ease the ache in his chest, a wound reopened by fate's twisted mercy. Back in nowhere, life resumed, not as celebration, but as survival. Rocket and Nebula, Groot, Mantis, and Drax worked to rebuild the derelict celestial head into a refuge, a beacon for the displaced and broken, the forgotten and fearful. Nebula, no longer weapon or enemy, became backbone, patrolling streets, fixing infrastructure, scolding Drax for letting children climb too high, tending to wounded aliens with hands once built only for violence. Her voice softened, not in sound but in intent, sharp edges now wielded for protection rather than pride. Mantis learned humor, mischief, autonomy, pranking Drax, comforting children, asking existential questions that made Rocket groan and Groot giggle. Drax, freed from vengeance yet carrying loss as armor, found unexpected purpose among orphans, teaching them games and how to roar loudly enough to frighten shadows. His laughter returned not as mask but as rebirth. Groot grew into adolescence, tall, lean, branches forming armor-like plating, strength emerging with awkward confidence, but beneath the physical transformation lay the same gentle loyalty, a soul shaped by sacrifice and belonging. Rocket, their reluctant captain in Peter's grief-stricken absence, bore responsibility not with arrogance but exhaustion, managing defenses, negotiating supply, directing repairs, barking orders whenever emotions threatened to surface, because vulnerability still felt like a luxury he could not afford. And throughout nowhere rang music, sometimes joyful, sometimes mournful, because for them, melody had always been a language deeper than words, a reminder that life, even shattered, could still hum. Peter, meanwhile, unraveled. He drank not to celebrate, but to forget, slumped over bars, staggering through corridors, clutching memories like shards that cut deeper each time he tried to hold them. His grief was not merely for Gamora, it was cumulative, layered. His mother stolen by cancer and fate, his childhood stolen by space and survival, Yondu stolen by sacrifice, Gamora stolen by destiny, twisted through time, even his own identity frayed by years of trying to protect others while still learning how to exist without pain. He once used music to cope, now he feared it because songs triggered memories of things he could not rebuild. He once danced to survive, now movement felt like betrayal of sorrow. He once believed in family, now the fear of failing the one he lost silenced him into isolation. The Guardians watched, helpless not because they could not intervene, but because they understood grief. Rocket recognizing the hollow stare of someone terrified of feeling, Nebula respecting pain's need for quiet, Drax offering silent companionship, Mantis reaching out gently, only when invited, Groot resting beside him without speaking. Peter's collapse was not weakness, it was the body demanding time to learn how to breathe after heartbreak too large to swallow. But life, especially life among the Guardians, does not pause for healing. Danger always finds them first. Adam Warlock, golden weapon born of sovereign arrogance and desperation, arrived like a falling star, fury wrapped in naivety, strength untempered by judgment, purpose unshaped by understanding. He crashed into nowhere with celestial force, fists glowing, eyes burning with manufactured purpose. Retrieve Rocket at all costs. The Sovereign had not forgotten humiliation. Aisha, their high priestess, had not forgiven Rocket's theft or the Guardian's mockery. Revenge brewed in genetic perfection, and Adam, still infant despite divine creation, flew with power greater than thought. His arrival fractured peace instantly, explosions ripping through market squares, civilians screaming, Drax thrown aside like paper, Nebula fighting with steel and cybernetic rage, Mantis trembling yet charging to defend, Groot expanding into monstrous form to shield children, Rocket mocking even as he bled, until Adam's strike pierced. Rocket's chest and the bravado fell silent, the smallest and fiercest heart among them suddenly still on the floor of the place they dared to call home. The world narrowed to a heartbeat failing to beat. Rocket, the genius, the survivor, the cynic, the protector, the soul who refused to admit he cared, lay dying, not in glorious battle against cosmic tyrants, but in sudden violence born of old grudges and hostile pride. Panic surged through the Guardians like wildfire. Peter sobered instantly, sprinting toward his fallen friend with desperate horror, screaming Rocket's name not with anger but terror, because as much as he had retreated from leadership, he could not abandon the one who anchored him in ways he had never said aloud. Groot tried to cradle Rocket, branches trembling, whispering, "I am Groot," over and over like a prayer. Nebula, once broken and rebuilt by force, now shook with fear she thought she had buried, because losing Rocket meant losing the first person who ever saw her as more than weapon. Drax, who lost a family once, froze as memory collided with present, heartbreaking in ways muscles could not defend against. Mantis wept, hands glowing with desperation, but her powers could not heal wounds so deep, and Peter, who had lost too many, who refused to lose one more, placed trembling hands on Rocket's body and vowed through gritted teeth that death would not take what family had given him again. But saving Rocket was not straightforward. Beneath flesh and bone lay the cruel truth of his creation. An internal kill switch, a fail-safe installed by the High Evolutionary, preventing unauthorized medical access. Rocket, who had escaped cages, refused experiments, built identity from rebellion and pain, was still owned by science he thought he had outrun. The Guardians could not heal him without unlocking his past, and so began a journey not outward, but inward, into the history Rocket never shared, into memories he buried so deeply he forgot how sharp they were. As the ship launched toward Orgoscope in frantic urgency, Peter Quill returned not as hero, but as leader forged in necessity. Grief hardened into determination, and he would not fail another member of his family. Nebula stood beside him, steady and protective. Mantis whispered courage into their hearts. Drax sharpened resolve like blade. Groot stayed close, vines braided protectively around Rocket's limp form. Through emergency alarms and frantic piloting, through fractured breathing and whispered pleas, one truth rang clear. Salvation was no longer cosmic. It was personal. Rocket, unconscious, drifted through memory. Cages, steel hands, screaming friends, whispered names like prayers to a god who never listened. Laughter stolen by laboratories, innocence dissected by ambition. But that story belongs fully to the next chapter. For now, what mattered was this. Peter Quill, drunk on grief 5 minutes earlier, now stood at the helm of destiny once again, eyes blazing not with vengeance but love, raw, unfiltered, desperate. He lost Gamora, he lost Yondu, he lost childhood, he lost safety, he refused now to lose Rocket. And in that moment, as alarms blared and stars streaked past, the Guardians did not move as fractured souls, but as family on the brink, terrified, grieving, furious, loyal beyond reason. Silence no longer felt like void. It felt like breath before battle. Loss no longer paralyzed. It fueled resolve. Peter wiped tears from Rocket's fur and whispered a promise only grief can teach. Not this time. The search for Gamora had led Peter into sorrow. The fight to save Rocket would lead him back into himself. Chapter 13. Nowhere, No Home. There are battles fought on battlefields, and then there are battles fought inside the ribs, where fear claws through bone and memory drips like poison. For the Guardians, the mission to save Rocket was not a quest for glory, nor a war against cosmic tyrants, but a descent into the most intimate hell they had ever faced, the one where hope and horror share the same breath, where every heartbeat feels like a countdown, where the stakes are not galaxies or civilizations, but one life, one friend, one soul whose survival mattered more than victory ever could. As the Bowie cut through space toward Orgoscope, panic simmered in the quiet between ship alarms. Rocket lay unconscious, chest rising shallowly, fur matted with blood and fear, every machine beep a reminder that time stretched thin, hope threaded through wires and desperation. Peter Quill, who once fought gods and celestials with swagger and song, now faced an enemy more terrifying than Thanos or Ego. The possibility of losing Rocket, not through battle but through helplessness, through failure to protect the family he did not choose but could not live without. He moved through the ship not with bravado but urgency, hands shaking not from fury but terror, voice hoarse from calling Rocket's name into silence. Nebula monitored vitals with military precision, her jaw clenched though her cybernetics betrayed tiny tremors. She had survived torture, exile, war, and betrayal, but the sight of Rocket's limp body triggered a fear she could barely process, because losing him meant losing the first person who ever believed she could be more than what she was built to be. Mantis held Rocket's paw between her palms, whispering comfort through tears she didn't bother to hide, her empathy not power now but wound, feeling his pain even in unconsciousness, shaking as the memories clawed at her heart. Groot sat by Rocket's side, branches wrapped protectively around him, repeating softly, "I am Groot," in tones that vibrated with sorrow, fear, and a devotion so pure it hurt the room to hear. Drax, who once measured strength by destruction, now stood guard at the door, fists clenched not to strike but to steady himself, the loss of a family once having hollowed him so deeply that he could not allow it again. The warrior who once sought death now fought like hell to protect life, and Peter, frantic, broken, determined, prepared for infiltration not with witty quips or reckless confidence, but with the steadiness of a man who has already lost too much and refuses to lose again. Orgoscope unfolded before them like a nightmare disguised as biology, a living corporate fortress floating in space, flesh-welded steel, corridors pulsing like veins, bioengineered structures mimicking anatomy with grotesque corporate polish, a literal organism turned factory, a physical manifestation of the high evolutionaries' belief that life is a product to be molded. Catalogued and perfected, it was bureaucracy married to flesh, capitalism fused to cruelty, a place designed not to save life but to own it. The Guardians donned suits, nerves raw yet held together by a single thread of purpose, and descended into the viscera-like halls of the compound. It was here, upon entry, that they encountered Gamora. The Gamora who did not know them, did not love them, did not see in Peter a partner, or in Groot a companion, or in Rocket a brother in arms. She came as Ravager, flanked by pirates who saw the Guardians not as family, but as nuisance. Her stance defensive, voice sharp, eyes cold enough to slice through memory. Peter froze, breath stolen, not by shock, but by grief reborn. The woman he mourned stood inches from him, alive, fierce, whole, but unfamiliar. Her gaze hard like when he first met her, before laughter softened her, before trust cracked open her armor. He pleaded not for love but for help. Rocket was dying and desperation outweighed pride. Yet Gamora reacted not with tenderness but suspicion, because she owed them nothing, understood them not by lived history but whispered rumors and confusing glances from Nebula. Their exchange was jagged, painful, like dragging a heart through glass. Peter tried to speak to her soul, but souls do not recognize voices they have not grown alongside. With tension sharp as a blade, they infiltrated Orgoscope, clumsy, arguing, grief and resentment dragging behind them like anchors, but united by the urgency of one life hanging by a thread. Inside, the facility pulsed like a grotesque womb, filled with flesh doors and nerve cables and bureaucrats encased in gelatinous armor, smiling with corporate smugness as they catalogued lives like inventory. Mantis and Drax clung to walls in comedic panic, yet with stakes too high for humor to fully land. Nebula barked directions with merciless clarity. Groot shifted forms, growing shields from bark, vines from arms. Peter stumbled between leadership and heartbreak, trying to focus while Gamora glared daggers with every doubt she voiced. Meanwhile, Rocket's mind, sedated and flickering, sank deep into the past he had always buried, and his memories unfolded not like recollection, but like awakening into a trauma frozen behind his eyes since birth. We saw him not as smart-mouthed mercenary, not as pilot, not as guardian, but as frightened creature, no larger than a puppy, trembling inside a metal cage while cold hands modified him, while mechanical claws tore and rebuilt, while the high evolutionary's voice echoed through labs as god, judge, scientist, tormentor. Little Rocket reached through bars toward soft eyes, Lila, otter with cybernetic limbs but heart untouched by cruelty, Floor, rabbit with steel legs and stammering warmth, Teefs, walrus with metal frame and innocence shaped into laughter. They were misfits like future guardians, but innocent, naive, believing in freedom because they had never tasted it. They whispered dreams of sky and open fields, not knowing that the high evolutionary saw them not as lives but failures, prototypes to discard once purpose served. His cruelty was not violent rage but sterile conviction. Perfection required suffering, and anything less than his vision did not deserve existence. Young Rocket, trembling under a spotlight, operated on with no anesthetic, cried not because pain broke him, but because he felt fear and love and understanding too deeply for a creature meant only to obey. He solved puzzles beyond comprehension, and his gift, intelligence meant to elevate, became curse because it made him aware of his prison, aware of his friends' innocence, aware of the lies in their promised paradise. Back in the present, alarms blared as the Guardians extracted data from Orgoscope's grotesque brain server, only to learn the kill switch code was not here. They had risked everything and gained nothing but memory and fury. Gamora, frustrated, aggressive, terrified by their desperation, nearly abandoned them, but when confronted not by Peter's love, but by Rocket's life, by Groot's innocence, by Nebula's raw plea, something shifted. Not recognition, not reunion, but reluctant respect. As they escaped, leaping through living airlocks and flesh corridors, chaos erupted. Guards swarmed, alarms shrieked, and the Bowie barely launched as enemies fired projectiles of bone and plasma. Through the chaos, Peter saw Gamora's eyes flash, not with love, but with a hint of understanding, that they were not idiots or dreamers or clinging fools. They were family, broken and desperate, fighting for one of their own with terrifying conviction. She left them not cruelly, but conflicted, lingering a moment longer than logic required. A seed planted, not watered yet, but alive. As they fled, Rocket's condition worsened. His breath slowed, heartbeat faltered. consciousness flickered between memory and oblivion. His flashbacks deepened, Lila whispering promises of freedom, of skies, of names carved into wood beside rivers they would one day find. Their tiny voices echoed in sterile cells, speaking dreams no cruelty had extinguished. But when Rocket discovered the truth, that the High Evolutionary never intended to let them live, that they were disposable stepping stones toward perfection, hope snapped like bone. His scream, tiny yet soul-splitting, reverberated across decades into his present unconscious body, and the audience felt what the Guardians did not yet see. The birth of Rocket's rage was not pride, not rebellion, it was grief, pure and devastating. And it would not fade, not ever. Aboard the Bowie, the Guardians regrouped, shaken, exhausted, angry, afraid. Peter snapped at Mantis and Drax. Drax, hurt, punched walls rather than voices. Nebula nearly shattered under the weight of leadership and helplessness. Groot hovered protectively over Rocket. Mantis cried and comforted and mediated. Gamora, gone back to Ravagers, lingered in Peter's thoughts like phantom limb, and Peter, breath shaking, confessed not to them but to himself. He did not know how to save Rocket, did not know how to lead, did not know how to live under the weight of losing again. But Rocket was not gone, not yet. And that truth held them together like gravity around a collapsing star. Home was once Earth for Peter, space for Gamora, vengeance for Drax, compartments for Nebula, jokes for Rocket, innocence for Groot. Now, home was a dying friend, a mission born from love, a desperation forged from chosen family. Nowhere had become home, but without Rocket conscious, even home felt hollow. Yet they moved forward because grief did not paralyze them anymore. It propelled them, sharpened them, strengthened them. They had lost before, they had broken before, they had rebuilt before, and they would again for Rocket. Because sometimes home is not a place, but a promise. They had no code yet, no solution, no guarantee. But they had each other, fragments, arguments, fear, devotion, hope. And in the vast silence of space, with alarms muted and stars steady in their ancient watch, one truth settled like gravity in their bones. They would burn the universe before letting Rocket die. Chapter 15: The Final Flight of the Guardians. In the end, great stories do not end because the universe demands it. They end because the hearts that shaped them must continue elsewhere, changed by love, scarred by loss, strengthened by every sacrifice whispered into the silent dark between stars. And so the Guardians of the Galaxy, once a ragtag crew of broken souls stumbling into destiny, reached the final chapter of their shared flight, not with explosions or cosmic prophecy, but with quiet choices made after victory. Choices born not from battlefield chaos, but from the gentle weight of healing settling across their shoulders, like starlight finally allowed to rest. When the High Evolutionary fell and his empire collapsed in fire and ruin, when cages burst open and trembling children and creatures were led into freedom, when Nowhere's engines hummed with life instead of fear, the Guardians did not stand tall as gods crowned by triumph. They simply breathed deeply and painfully, like survivors who had carried the universe on their backs and finally set it down. Rocket Raccoon, once experiment, once fugitive, once thief, now stood surrounded by those who fought for him and beside him, and in his quiet eyes something ancient finally dissolved, the belief that he must face pain alone. He had won not because he killed the man who made him, but because he refused to become him. Vengeance did not define him. Mercy did. It was here in the aftermath, when no galaxy watched and no legend demanded, that the Guardians confronted their truest enemy, silence after survival, the moment when warriors have to decide who they are without war. Peter Quill leaned against a railing, the hum of nowhere around him, heavy heart beating in a chest that had carried too much grief and not enough rest. His eyes searched the crowd of rescued children, ravaged but alive, and within their hope he saw a memory of himself, a boy in Missouri clutching a Walkman, dreaming of heroes, longing for safety in a world that kept taking from him. He had lost Gamora, found her again, and lost her once more, not to death, but to time, to destiny that carved her into a woman who did not remember him, who owed him nothing, who did not carry their shared future in her heart. When she turned to him after the battle, dirt on her face and exhaustion in her stance, she did not smile sadly or offer apology. She simply acknowledged him, a nod, a breath, a truth. We were something in a world that is gone. And Peter, clenching pain into acceptance, nodded back. Love does not always return to its starting place. Sometimes it becomes something else. Memory, gratitude, ache. And so he did not ask her to stay. He did not chase. He let her go. For love without freedom is not love. And Peter understood at last that holding on can sometimes be the closest act to losing yourself. He simply watched her walk to the Ravagers, where a family, not his, but hers, waited. She smiled there, fully, deeply, genuinely. Not the smile he once knew, but a new one, born of her own path. And in that smile, Peter found peace not in reunion, but in knowing she was safe, loved, chosen. Meanwhile, Drax the Destroyer, father, warrior, fool, heart, wiped tears from his face disguised as sweat, staring at the laughing children he had saved. Alien eyes reflecting innocence he thought forever lost when Ronan stole his family long ago. He watched them climb structures, bicker, run, live up, and something in him shifted as if the universe itself whispered the truth he had been too blinded by vengeance to see. He was never meant only to fight. He was meant to love, to protect, to parent. Nebula saw it too, eyes scanning the newfound community forming within nowhere, recognizing in Drax not a soldier but a father figure, a protector whose strength came not only from muscle but from devotion. "You're not a destroyer," she told him, voice low, metal hand resting on his arm. "You're a dad." And in that moment, Drax, who once roared against gods and destiny, smiled softly and let himself believe the universe had given him a second chance, not to avenge family, but to be family again. He would remain on Nowhere, not to fight monsters, but to help raise dreamers, to fill halls once haunted by fear, with laughter that healed worlds he could never avenge. Mantis, gentle and powerful, touched Rocket's fur one last time, then Drax's shoulder, feeling the emotions rippling through her friends like waves against rock. She had been shield, comfort, truth teller, and heart healer, but she realized that in giving so much of herself to others, she had never learned who she was without them. Every feeling she ever felt belonged to someone else first. Every decision she made followed someone else's journey. She needed to find her own, so she stood, trembling but determined, and told them she was leaving, not as rejection, but as growth. Her voice quivered, her eyes filled with love, and she asked Drax to stay with the children, trusting him, honoring him, not because he was strong, but because he was kind. Drax, struggling not to cry, nodded. Peter hugged her, fragile but proud. Nebula placed a hand on hers, not commanding but blessing. Groot leaned down, vines carefully wrapping her in farewell, and Rocket, voice soft, simply said, "Take care of yourself. You deserve to know who you are." Mantis left riding 3 psychic beasts into a dawn no one else could see, not lost, finally found. Nebula, who once sought only to escape Thanos' shadow, now stood proudly in the light, chosen leader of a rebuilt Nowhere, a general turned guardian of the forgotten. commander not of soldiers but of survivors. Her strength no longer in blades but in care. She hugged Rocket, stiff at first, then with surprising tenderness, and told him she was proud, words she once would have screamed instead of said. Then she watched Drax lead laughing children through the town square, and she knew the galaxy did not need another warrior as much as it needed someone to help rebuild. Nebula stayed not from duty, but purpose, a life earned, not imposed. Groot, taller, powerful, a living tree of loyalty and memory, stood beside Rocket as family dispersed, vines curling protectively as if roots could hold together what goodbye tried to separate. He watched each member walk their path and whispered, "I am Groot." Not farewell, but gratitude, promise, and love braided into three sacred words that only those who truly know him can understand. He would stay with Rocket, because Groot does not bloom alone, and Peter Quill, for the first time since he was a child, ripped from Earth into a galaxy too vast to understand, returned home, not to escape pain, but to face it. He arrived on Terra not as Star-Lord, savior of galaxies, leader of misfits, but as Peter, son of Meredith, boy who lost everything and now sought to find something simple, himself. He knocked on a door, breath trembling, and an old man with familiar eyes and tired hands opened. "Grandpa," Peter whispered. Time did not rewind, it moved forward. The two embraced, and history softened, but the Guardians did not end, they transformed. On Nowhere, Rocket approached the console, paws hovering over a music playlist, not Peter's, but his, a new chapter, scored by the creature who once feared silence. He assembled a new team: Kraglin, bow ready; Cosmo, loyal and eager; Phyla, child rescued from nightmare; Adam Warlock, confused but learning; Groot, towering and strong. Rocket, for the first time, stood not behind a leader, but as one. He pressed play. Music filled the air. Not tears, not rage, but joy. And with a familiar phrase, that steady oath spoken through galaxies and grief, he nodded. "Guardians, let's go." The ship lifted, nowhere shone, lives saved, breathed. And across the stars, paths diverged like constellations forming for the first time. Peter eating breakfast in sunlight, Nebula commanding hope, Mantis forging identity, Drax becoming father, Gamora finding tribe, Groot growing forests of strength, Rocket leading not from anger but love. The story did not end, it changed shape, because family isn't who starts with you. It's who stays, who grows, who lets you go when you need to fly. And the Guardians, born in chaos, ended in peace not because they stopped fighting, but because they learned who they were beyond battle. Broken, healed, scarred, and whole. In a universe of collapsing stars and forgotten gods, they proved the greatest power was never infinity, never perfection, never immortality. It was choosing each other again and again, even when the universe didn't notice. They were never legends because they saved the galaxy. They were legends because they saved each other. And so the Guardians of the Galaxy made their final flight together, not into darkness, but into dawn. A quiet ending not marked doom by death, but by life continuing, love evolving, and hope taking new shapes. They did not fade, they scattered, like seeds finding new soil, like constellations reform. And somewhere in the vastness of space, music still plays in an old ship. Laughter still echoes in metallic halls, and a raccoon hums softly while a tree watches, loyal and eternal. Because legends do not die, they just go home. Chapter 1: A Lost Boy in the Stars. In the quiet suburbs of Missouri, on a night where the sky felt too big for the world beneath it, A young boy named Peter Quill clutched a Walkman to his chest like it was the only anchor he had left, a final shield against a reality collapsing faster than he could understand. The music in his ears, songs of love, loss, hope, and longing, was not just a soundtrack to his childhood. It was the last thread connecting him to the woman lying in a hospital bed before him, a woman who whispered to him about starlight and forever, and the promise that he would never be alone, even though fate was preparing to prove her wrong in the cruelest way possible. Meredith Quill, radiant even in sickness, once danced in kitchens, sang through sadness, held her son with hands that believed love could armor him from the universe. But the universe, indifferent and merciless, waited in silence for the moment it would break him. Her voice trembled as she asked for his hand, her final request simple yet impossible: to face her departure with courage. But Peter, too young to carry such a burden, too overwhelmed by a pain that felt like the world folding inwards, could not take that hand in time. And when her fingers fell lifeless, a fracture formed in him that would never fully heal. In the seconds that followed, grief hit him with a force that thundered louder than any storm, a raw, childlike wail tearing out of him as nurses tried to hold him, as the room blurred, as the air itself seemed to collapse. He ran because running was the only instinct left, running out into the night where the sky stretched infinite, and there, in the solitude of that field, in the breath between sobs, the universe answered him not with comfort but with abduction, as a Ravager's ship descended, bathing him in alien light and ripping him from the only world he had ever known. The wind screaming around him as he rose away from Earth, away from innocence, away from the last touch of his mother. The stars, which she once told him were beautiful, became a prison in that moment, cold, unfamiliar, merciless. And as the ship cut through the void, the boy's tears dried, not because grief had passed, but because space left no room for breath. Peter Quill, age 8, entered the cosmos not as a chosen hero, not as a destined savior, but as a stolen child, one heartbreak into a universe built on them. His captors, Ravagers led by Yondu Udonta, were not angels nor demons but raiders shaped by lawless stars, men who live by fire and plunder and the code that only the strong survive. And in this world, strength was not measured in power, but in how much pain one could swallow without breaking. Yondu, blue-skinned and cold-eyed, dragged the trembling boy into a life foreign beyond comprehension. Yet, even in his hardened face flickered something complicated: annoyance, responsibility, and a reluctant affection buried so deep it masqueraded as threat. "Boy, you're in space," he barked, not as comfort but as fact. Yet beneath the gruff exterior, a choice had already been made. He would not deliver Peter to Ego, the living planet who had hired him to retrieve his son. Something in Yondu balked, sensing doom in that destiny, and so he kept the child, raising him not with warmth, but with a survivalist brutality born from knowing the universe showed mercy to no one. Peter grew not with lullabies, but with blasters firing in the dark corridors of Ravager ships, not with bedtime stories, but with tales of betrayal, space wars, and codes of loyalty thicker than blood but sharper than knives. The boy's grief calcified into sarcasm, into bravado, into a shell he used to deflect the loneliness that gnawed at him in every silent moment. His mother's voice faded into mixtapes, her memory carried in a worn Walkman like a relic, a heartbeat he replayed each time the void pressed too close. Music became not just nostalgia but survival. Earth became not a home he missed, but a wound that never closed. He learned to steal, to lie, to fight, to smile through fear, to laugh louder than the ache inside him. He learned that family in space was a dangerous word, easily twisted into chains or sharpened into weapons. And yet, for all his front, for all the swagger he would later adopt, for all the names he tried to give himself, Star-Lord most of all, he remained at his core that same boy standing in a hospital room, hand hovering inches from a mother's outstretched fingers he could not bring himself to grasp. The galaxy did not wait for him to find peace. It taught its lessons through violence, through loss, through reminders that innocence had no place among stars ruled by fear and ambition. Ravager life hardened him, but it also shaped him, giving him skills, building instincts, teaching him that trust was currency and betrayal a language. Still, there were cracks even then, moments where Peter didn't just survive but dreamed of Earth, of simplicity, of holding on to something pure. In those moments he clutched his Walkman like a prayer, headphones sealing him from the chaos, melodies suturing wounds time refused to close. He played awesome mix Volume 1, not as entertainment, but as memory, each song a ghost weaving his past into the present, each lyric a reminder that he once belonged somewhere, that he once mattered to someone. And when loneliness threatened to swallow him, he built walls, not of anger but humor, jokes as armor, laughter as shield, charm as distraction. Because if he could make the galaxy laugh, maybe it wouldn't notice he was breaking. But beneath the jokes, beneath the swagger, beneath the outlaw exterior that would one day make him infamous, Peter Quill was still running, not from danger, but from the moment he couldn't take his mother's hand. That failure echoed across his life, shaping every attachment he feared making, every goodbye he refused to face, every risk he took to distract himself from the emptiness carved inside him by grief and starlight. The universe had taken him violently, and so he learned to fight violently, yet in quiet hours aboard Ravager ships, when engines hummed and stars drifted past indifferent and eternal, he would lie awake and stare into darkness, wondering if Earth missed him or if it had already forgotten the boy it lost. In those moments when silence felt like a suffocating void, Yondu's threats were replaced by softer, hidden truths. The Ravager leader watching him from afar, wrestling with emotions he'd never voice, proud of the boy's resilience yet terrified of the vulnerability beneath it, knowing one day Peter would have to face a past larger than any star map. Time passed not in years, but in scars and battles. Peter learned to pilot ships before he knew how to trust faces. He learned that in space, laughter was often the language of pain, and loyalty was forged not in safety, but in shared danger. He grew into a man who could charm a cantina full of criminals and steal relics from temples while humming 80s tunes. A man who would one day swagger through the galaxy pretending he feared nothing while secretly fearing everything. Most of all, being abandoned again. His childhood had been stolen, but from it, something paradoxical was born. A hero shaped not by destiny but by hurt, not by prophecy, but by survival, not by perfection, but by brokenness. He did not enter the cosmic stage as a savior. He stumbled into it as a man trying to find meaning in the shards of a life shattered before it began. When Peter finally rebelled fully against the Ravagers and Yondu's authority, taking the Milano and striking out alone as a scavenger and self-proclaimed outlaw, calling himself Star-Lord and waiting for the universe to recognize the name, it was not an act of independence but of defiance, a declaration that he would no longer be defined by loss, even though every step he took still carried his shadow. He sought treasure because treasure filled space where affection once lived. He chased adventure because stillness meant remembering. He flirted with danger because death did not frighten him as much as loneliness. And yet, despite all his masks, beneath the layered bravado and the playful arrogance, Peter's heart remained inexplicably open, waiting, even if he would never admit it, for a reason to stop running, for someone to tell him the universe could hold more than pain. But the cosmos does not give healing freely. It demands confrontation. And Peter Quill, the lost boy from Missouri floating alone in galactic chaos, was destined to collide with fate once again, not through prophecy, but through a stolen orb, a chance encounter, and a motley group of broken souls who were just as lost as he was. Before they found each other, before the galaxy would one day call them heroes, before sacrifice and grief and redemption would forge them into a family, Peter was simply a child, torn from Earth, clutching music like memory, drifting through stars that felt too cold, too vast, too quiet, a boy trying to become a myth so he wouldn't remain a wound. And one day, soon, when the right song played and the right moment came, that myth would begin to take shape, not as a legend born from greatness, but as a legend born from loss. A child who became Star-Lord because being Peter Quill hurt too much. Chapter 2. Yondu, Udonta, Father made of thorns. In a universe that devours weakness and worships power, few figures embodied contradiction like Yondu Udonta, the blue-skinned ravager who raised the boy he was meant to deliver to his death. A man who hid his humanity beneath layers of cruelty and sarcasm, whose heart was buried beneath scars earned in a lifetime of betrayal and exile. Long before the name Peter Quill ever reached his ears, Yondu had already been banished from the Ravager elite, cast out by Stakar Ogord for breaking their sacred code, a code that forbade trafficking in children. But Yondu had already crossed that line. He had ferried the offspring of a celestial being named Ego across the stars, unaware at first of the purpose until he saw the pattern too many times. Every child he delivered disappeared. None ever returned. When Ego demanded he fetch another, something in Yondu's gut twisted, a primal instinct he could neither explain nor ignore. He looked at the boy before him, small, trembling, still clutching the relic of a world he no longer belonged to. And for the first time in his life, Yondu Udonta hesitated. He was a ravager, a pirate, a survivor. Hesitation was death. But in that moment, morality outweighed money, and guilt outweighed fear. He made a choice that would damn him among his kind but save a single life. He kept the boy, and in doing so, he created the only bond in the galaxy that would ever make him human again. Raising Peter Quill was not an act of kindness, it was a punishment, a mirror held up to every failure Yondu had ever made. He was no father, at least not by the definitions of love and patience that mortals used. His world had no room for softness. The crew of the Eclector followed him out of loyalty and fear, men and aliens who thrived in chaos, who pillaged, traded, and killed as easily as breathing. Among them a child was a liability, a reminder of innocence in a place built on sin. So Yondu taught Peter the only way he knew, through survival. He mocked him, threatened him, cursed him, pushed him until the boy learned that mercy was a weakness, and trust a risk few survived. I may look mean, but you were the one born in space, he'd snarl when Peter cried or questioned him. But behind every insult, behind every growl, there lingered the quiet weight of guilt. Yondu had stolen this child from his planet, yet he would not let the galaxy steal him further. He armed him with cunning, with wit, with a moral flexibility that was less corruption than armor. When the Ravagers laughed at the boy's earthly sentimentality, his songs, his trinkets, his talk of home, Yondu laughed too, but softer, less cruelly. He'd seen the pain behind those jokes before, in mirrors and memories of his own. The arrow that Yondu controlled with a whistle became a symbol of who he was. Deadly, precise, elegant, but requiring focus born of restraint. It was the embodiment of everything he could not teach Peter directly. The boy learned quickly that Yondu's anger was a test, that the sharpness in his tone hid something fragile beneath. Yet the love between them, if it could be called that, was built on denial. Yondu refused to admit he cared, because caring meant weakness, and weakness in space meant death. Still, every time Peter found himself in danger, every time a deal went wrong or a bounty turned violent, Yondu was there. Not with a comforting embrace, but with that deadly arrow slicing through the dark, guided by a whistle that said everything his words never could. Years turned the boy into a man, and the man into an annoyance. Peter's rebellion was inevitable. It was Yondu's own defiance reflected back at him. When Peter stole the orb and went rogue, Yondu's rage was less about betrayal and more about heartbreak. He had raised a thief, but also a son, and now that son had chosen freedom over him. "I saved you," Yondu would shout later, years after the fact, voice cracking beneath fury and sorrow. "I didn't eat you." The line was meant to sting, to assert control, but beneath it lay the truth that Yondu himself didn't want to face. He had loved the boy in the only way he knew how, by keeping him alive, by preparing him for a universe that would never love him back. By the time the Guardians of the Galaxy had made their name, Yondu's legend among Ravagers had soured into infamy. He was no longer seen as a leader, but as a relic, a man whose choices had exiled him from the brotherhood that once gave him purpose. The crew around him, especially the mutinous Taserface, saw his attachment to Quill as weakness. They mocked the softness they thought they saw, not realizing that the steel of Yondu's heart had always been forged from loss. When he learned that Peter had the orb and the Collector was involved, Yondu saw more than opportunity. He saw a second chance, a way to reconnect through business if not through family. But the universe, as always, offered him only chaos. During the events on Xandar, Yondu's relationship with Peter reached a boiling point. Betrayal, trickery, and near death defined their encounters, yet through it all, Yondu never stopped protecting him, even when pretending otherwise. He could have killed Peter 100 times over. Instead, he kept giving him chances, and when Ronan's wrath threatened to annihilate entire worlds, when the Guardians joined forces to stop him, Yondu stood on the sidelines, pretending to be a pirate chasing profit while secretly taking pride in the man the boy had become. For all his bluster, for all his threats, he never delivered the final blow. Because Yondu knew something Peter did not. He had always been proud. When the dust of that first war settled, when Xandar celebrated and the galaxy crowned its new heroes, Yondu stood alone aboard the Eclector, looking at the small totem Peter had left him, a troll doll replacing the Infinity Stone he thought he'd stolen. It was a joke, yes, but it was also a message. Forgiveness wrapped in humor, love disguised as mischief. Exactly the language Yondu understood best. He smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. The boy he raised was gone, but the man he became still carried his lessons. Somewhere deep inside, Yondu knew that his purpose, the redemption for his sins, had already been fulfilled. But fate, relentless and patient, was not finished with him yet. When Ago resurfaced, revealing himself as Peter's true father, Yondu's sins came full circle. He had kept the boy from his biological parent out of guilt and instinct, but he could never explain why. The truth was simple. Yondu had sensed the darkness in Ego long before anyone else. He had seen the trail of children left behind like discarded experiments, had realized too late what the Celestial's purpose truly was. When Peter finally learned who Ego was and what he had done, when the illusion of a father crumbled into the horror of manipulation, Yondu returned not as captor or rival, but as savior. The Ravager who had stolen his childhood became the man who saved his soul. As they fled Ego's collapsing planet, Yondu made the choice that defined his existence, to give his own life for the boy he once claimed to despise. Holding Peter in his arms as the vacuum claimed them, his voice softened in a way it never had before. "He may have been your father, boy," he said, eyes burning with the last flicker of life, "but he wasn't your daddy." In that single line, the entirety of Yondu's life, every crime, every lie, every wound, found purpose. He had spent decades denying what he was, but in his final breath he accepted it. He was a father, flawed and brutal, but a father nonetheless. The arrow that once symbolized death now floated silent beside him, its master gone, its song ended. The man who had stolen a child from Earth became the man who gave that child back to himself. The Ravager funeral that followed was not just a farewell, it was a redemption. Stakar and his crew, the same brotherhood that had exiled Yondu, appeared one by one in streaks of color and light, honoring him at last. It was the universe's way of acknowledging that even the damned could earn grace. As the flames consumed his body and the ashes scattered into the void, Peter Quill wept not as the outlaw Star-Lord, not as the hero of the galaxy, but as the boy who had finally taken his father's hand, even if it was too late. The light of the fireworks reflected in his eyes, and for the first time since that hospital room on Earth, he allowed himself to grieve, not for what he lost, but for what he found too late to keep. Yondu's legacy did not end with his death. His influence lingered in every choice the Guardians made afterward, in Rocket's quiet guilt, in Peter's newfound humility, in the way the team learned to protect each other not out of obligation but out of love. Yondu had shown them that family was not blood, not destiny, not even forgiveness. It was the act of staying when leaving would be easier. In the cracks of his cruelty lay the foundation of everything that made the Guardians who they were. He was the storm that tempered them, the thorned father whose love cut as deeply as it healed. In the vastness of the Marvel Universe, gods rise and fall, empires collapse, heroes ascend into myth. But Yondu Udonta's story endures because it is not about power. It is about redemption earned too late, love discovered through pain, and the realization that even the most broken souls can become someone's home. The boy he saved carried that lesson into the stars, leading others just as lost as he once was, repeating the pattern that had once saved him. And somewhere in the silence between the stars, in the faint echo of a Ravager's whistle, one might still imagine that arrow darting through the dark, guided by the memory of a man who finally learned that fatherhood was not about blood, but about sacrifice. Yondu Udonta, pirate, Ravager, sinner, savior, became the proof that thorns can bloom into something beautiful, and that even in the coldest corners of space, love can take root in the most unlikely of hearts. Chapter 3: Misfits of the Galaxy. There are moments in the universe when destiny does not announce itself with prophecy or grandeur, but collides in chaos, pulled together not by fate's elegance, but by the violent gravity of broken souls searching for purpose. And nowhere was this truer than on the urban world of Xandar, where 5 strangers, each carrying scars deeper than any blade could cut, crossed paths not because they sought heroism, but because survival had forced them into orbits destined to crash into one another. And like stars collapsing into a new constellation, their union did not begin with unity, but with conflict, distrust, and desperation. Peter Quill, calling himself Star-Lord with the fragile confidence of a child, still hoping the universe might someday say the name back, arrived on Xandar with a stolen orb tucked under his jacket and a swagger designed to mask the fear that still lingered behind every smirk. Fear of belonging, fear of loss, fear that he was still that abandoned boy pretending to be more. But the orb was no ordinary relic. It was an infinity stone disguised as trinket, a cosmic heartbeat powerful enough to tear the galaxy apart. And because nothing forged in pain stays unnoticed for long, others came for it too. Gamora, daughter of Thanos not by blood, but by brutal redesign, the green-skinned assassin shaped by genocide and sharpened into a blade of obedience, sent not to protect the universe but to betray her so-called father and steal the artifact to prevent yet another world from suffering as hers had. She moved with grace honed through centuries of combat, her expression cold as steel, but beneath it lived a quiet desperation, the yearning of someone who had never been allowed to choose who she was, reaching for freedom for the first time. Then came Rocket, a creature built in agony, pieced together in a lab with bolts and sorrow and laughter sharp enough to cut, a raccoon not by nature but by cruelty, a sarcastic strategist whose genius rivaled any in the galaxy, yet whose greatest fear was stillness, because in stillness he could hear the echoes of cages and scalpels and screams from a past he'd give anything to forget. By his side towered Groot, a gentle tree being whose vocabulary of 3 words, "I am Groot," conveyed more sincerity than most civilizations could muster. He was Rocket's anchor, his closest companion, a being of kindness shaped not by science or war, but by instinct, loyalty, and the desire to protect, the softness in a universe too hard to bear. And last, crashing into this forming constellation, like a meteor of grief and rage, was Drax the Destroyer, a warrior whose laughter once filled a home now lost to Ronan's slaughter, a man who spoke truth with blunt edges because life had carved subtlety out of him along with his peace. His hunt for vengeance burned with the intensity of a star about to collapse, and though his muscles looked forged for war, his heart was cracked open, leaking sorrow with every strike. Their first encounter erupted not in camaraderie but in chaos, Peter trying to sell the orb, Gamora tackling him with ruthless precision, Rocket and Groot descending from rooftops with electronets and snare devices, each one seeking different salvation through the same prize, each one born from pain disguised as purpose. The air filled with shouting, blasters, tangled limbs, and accusations, a ballet of desperation painted across Xandar's pristine streets, and for a moment it seemed like they were nothing but animals clawing for survival in a civilized world. Civilians watched with horror as these strangers collided, not yet realizing that within this mess lay the embryo of a future that would one day save galaxies. The Nova Corps intervened, prison clamps and stun batons turning defiance into defeat, and in that instant the 5 misfits who would one day call themselves Guardians were thrown into confinement, not as allies but as enemies chained by circumstance. The Killen prison, a fortress carved from suffering, a mausoleum where hope went to die, greeted them not as guests but as carcasses waiting to be consumed by a system that had long given up believing in second chances. Peter walked through its gates with feigned bravado, eyes darting, assessing threats with the instinct of someone who had never truly felt safe. Gamora's presence drew a storm of hatred. Whispers of Thanos' daughter rippled through the prisoners like poison, and her reputation, earned not by her will but by Thanos, made her a target before she even stepped into her cell. Drax saw her and saw not a victim of circumstance but a symbol of the monster who took everything from him. His fists clenched, his voice shook with the weight of vengeance, and only the walls and Rocket's unexpected logic kept blood from spilling in that first hour. Rocket strutted through the prison like a spark ready to ignite gasoline, taunting guards and prisoners alike, his laughter a shield for a soul terrified of silence, while Groot walked beside him like a silent sentinel, his presence both comforting and unsettling to those who mistook his gentle nature for weakness. In this chaos, alliances formed not from trust but necessity. Peter, motivated by survival and the uneasy stirrings of empathy for Gamora, who, despite her lethal past, carried the look of someone just as tired of running as he was, made a choice that surprised even him, to defend someone others wished to kill. It was not heroism, not yet. It was instinct, the spark of decency buried beneath layers of trauma and bravado. Gamora, calculating yet quietly hopeful, accepted the temporary alliance, though her eyes revealed fear, not of death, but of wasting her one chance to break free from Thanos' shadow. Rocket, ever the tactician, recognized opportunity where others saw doom, and the gears in his mind turned, crafting a plan to escape not because he cared, but because he simply refused to live in a cage again. And Groot, steady, loyal, impossibly pure, followed because protecting Rocket was his purpose. And something in Peter and Gamora stirred a curiosity in him, a sense that this motley collection of souls was more than chance. The escape plan unfolded in chaos and ingenuity, Rocket rattling off instructions with manic certainty, Groot acting too early by ripping out a prison power core, alarms blaring, mechanical limbs whirring as guards scrambled to respond. Drax, drawn not by loyalty, but by the chance to find Ronan through association with Gamora, joined them, his vow turning into a reluctant pact. As they fought their way through the kiln, Peter leaping across platforms, Gamora slicing through drones with balletic precision, Rocket barking orders while assembling devices from scrap, Groot shielding allies with bark and strength. Their individuality collided into something strange and undeniable. They did not fight like strangers, but like pieces of a puzzle discovering their shape. On the Milano fleeing the prison in a blaze of confusion and manic triumph, something subtle began to shift. Peter joked to hide his uncertainty, trying to hold onto control. Rocket insulted everyone in equal measure to mask his growing attachment. Gamora looked out at the stars, not with dread, but with the fragile hope of a second chance. Drax sat in silence, carrying a weight heavier than any chain, and Groot offered the simplest comfort, a small flower, grown and gifted as if to say everything broken can still bloom. In that quiet, fractured peace, the orb sat between them like a ticking bomb, literal and emotional. None of them yet knew its power, only its value, but already Destin had bound them together more tightly than greed could ever sever. When the truth emerged that the orb contained an infinity stone capable of annihilating worlds, something in each of them shifted. Gamora's mission became not survival but redemption, to prevent the universe from repeating the fate of her childhood. Peter saw in this revelation a chance to do something larger than himself, to be more than a thief pretending at meaning. Rocket scoffed at heroism, yet there was hesitation in his voice, doubt cracking sarcasm like ice under strain, because deep inside he knew that those who turn away from responsibility become the monsters who once hurt them. Drax saw an opportunity not only for revenge but for purpose, because vengeance alone could not resurrect his family, and a cause beyond pain gave him something to stand for. And Groot simply nodded, as if he had known all along, as if protecting life was as natural as growing toward light. Their first stand against Ronan on Nowhere was not elegant, not polished, not the stuff of legend. It was messy, clumsy, filled with shouting and miscommunication, yet it was real. When the stone's power erupted, raw and uncontrollable, tearing flesh from bone and ripping through sanity, Peter moved not from strategy but from instinct, reaching for Gamora, refusing to let her die, his hand outstretched not as a hero but as a man who had once failed to grasp the hand that mattered most. "Take my hand," he said, echoing a moment that defined him, rewriting it in the fire of cosmic judgment. And when she gripped back, when Rocket and Drax and Groot united their strength with his to hold the stone's power at bay, something impossible happened. Not because they were destined, but because they chose each other. Five broken beings, once alone in the universe, held together, not through perfection, but through pain, each one proving that wounds can bind as strongly as love. They did not win because they were mighty, They won because they had finally stopped running. Groot's sacrifice, encasing them in a cocoon of branches, whispering, "We are Groot," with the gentle finality of a parent shielding children from fire, shattered the last illusions separating them. In death, Groot taught them what none of them yet understood. Family is not weakness, it is power, the kind forged in the quiet between battles, in the choice to stay when leaving is easier. When the dust settled and Ronan fell, when Xandar celebrated a victory built not by armies but by misfits who refused to let each other die, the galaxy gained not heroes but a family born from chaos. They called themselves the Guardians of the Galaxy, not out of arrogance, but because for the first time each of them had something worth guarding. Peter had found belonging not in Earth, but in those who stood beside him. Gamora took her first breath as a person, not a weapon. Rocket held the sapling of Groot and realized he was no longer alone. Drax laughed, not to hide pain, but to embrace life. And Groot, reborn, small but unbroken, danced to the rhythm of their shared future. They did not know it yet, but the universe had shifted. The Infinity Stones, Thanos' destiny, all waited in the shadows. But in that moment, aboard a ship patched together with hope, blasting music through speakers like a heartbeat refusing to fade, 5 lost souls became something unparalleled. Not heroes chosen by prophecy, not warriors forged by glory, but misfits who saved a galaxy because they chose each other when the universe offered them nothing but reasons to give up. And in that choice, they became more than survivors. They became a family that would shake the stars. Chapter 4: The First Choice to Be Better. There is a moment in every life, mortal or cosmic, when survival is no longer enough, when the instinct that once kept you alive gives way to something far more dangerous. The willingness to become more than what your past made you. And for the Guardians of the Galaxy, that moment arrived not with triumph, but with a relentless echo of sacrifice and consequence reverberating through the stars. Because after Xandar, after the Infinity Stone pulsed in their joined hands and nearly tore them apart, they were not crowned heroes. They were tested, humbled, and shaken by a responsibility that none of them had ever asked for, each carrying a bruise deeper than flesh, a reminder that the universe had offered them one fragile chance to choose not who they were, but who they could become. Peter Quill, dance-loving outlaw turned improbable savior, found himself staring at the stars from the bridge of the Milano, wrestling with a weight he had never known, not guilt, not grief, but the dizzying fear of purpose. For the first time since his mother's death, since Yondu's shadow shaped his childhood into armor, he had chosen someone else's life over his own without hesitation, and the act had cracked open an understanding he wasn't ready to face. That heroism did not feel like triumph, but like vulnerability stretching across your bones, like waking up and realizing that running was no longer an option. Gamora, forged by Thanos to kill hope everywhere she went, looked at her reflection and saw not a weapon, not a survivor alone in a universe that feared her touch, but a woman standing in the terrifying space between freedom and identity, her entire existence now measured not in the lives she had taken but in the ones she might protect. Her vow to stop her father no longer whispered in solitude, but shared among allies who saw her not as a monster, but as someone worth believing in. Drax, whose life had been consumed by vengeance as surely as Ronan's blade annihilated his family, now found himself without an enemy to strike, and in that silence pain returned in a form he could not punch. The fragility of purpose when revenge ends, the question of who he was when hatred was not his compass. So he clung to the only thing grounding him, the presence of those who, like him, had nowhere else to stand. Rocket, who had built his existence on cynicism and sarcasm, who mocked vulnerability because it was easier than admitting he longed for connection, felt Stone's power burn through his soul and realized that if he had died that day, someone would have mourned him. It was a truth he hated because it meant he could no longer pretend that he didn't care, that loyalty was a trick, that attachment was weakness. For the first time, caring did not feel like a liability, but like a terrifying new limb he didn't know how to use. And Groot, reborn as a sapling cradled in Rocket's hands, a flickering remnant of innocence that refused to be extinguished even by death itself, symbolized the truth none of them dared say aloud, that beginnings are born in endings, and families are born in sacrifice. Xander's clean, shining utopia did not transform them into saviors overnight. Medals and handshakes could not erase years of wounds or rewrite identities forged in fear. But the Nova Corps' gratitude planted a seed, the knowledge that their existence could mean protection rather than chaos. But even gratitude carried consequences. Their ship repaired and records cleaned. Their names whispered not with fear but with hope. They departed Xandar with a new title they barely understood, Guardians of the Galaxy, a phrase that sounded less like a blessing and more like an expectation, waiting to crush anyone unworthy of it. And so, they left, not basking in glory, but carrying a burden heavier than any trophy, trying to understand whether they had been transformed by destiny or merely stumbled into heroism by accident. Their next steps were not guided by noble intention, but by survival, curiosity, and the fragile thread of companionship. They accepted jobs, not glamorous ones, but enough to keep them afloat, enough to let them adjust to the strange new dynamic where trust was no longer a threat but a lifeline. Peter played music through the Milano speakers, letting the mixtape fill the air like oxygen, because in those melodies lay the reassurance that life could still be joyful even when responsibility pressed against the ribs. Gamora sharpened blades and studied star charts, searching for traces of her past and paths toward a future she had never allowed herself to imagine. Rocket tinkered restlessly, building gadgets not just for battle but for comfort, small modifications, small gifts disguised as utility, because generosity felt too raw to name. Drax, uncomfortable with quiet but learning to sit in it, shared stories of his wife and daughter, not with rage but with tenderness, rediscovering humanity in memory instead of pain. And baby Groot, growing leaf by leaf, taught them patience, teaching through simple presence that nurturing was not weakness, that care was a form of strength more enduring than any weapon. But the universe has a cruel rhythm, and peace is not something gifted, it is something borrowed until chaos remembers your name. The Sovereign, a genetically perfected race painting themselves in gold and arrogance, contracted the Guardians for a job, to protect valuable batteries from a creature of ravenous hunger. On the surface, it seemed simple, almost comedic, especially with Groot innocently dancing while the team fought around him, chaos choreographed to the rhythm of Peter's music. Yet beneath the humor lay truth. They were learning to fight not as individuals clawing for survival, but as a unit, their movements rough but synchronized, their trust unspoken but growing. They succeeded until Rocket, acting from instinctive defensiveness and deep-rooted mistrust, stole the very batteries they had been hired to protect. This act, petty yet profound, a reminder that healing is never linear, that trauma does not evaporate simply because one chooses goodness, set into motion a chain of events that would once again test their fragile unity. As the Sovereign fleet pursued them through the stars, golden drones swarming like locusts of judgment, the Guardians argued, bickered, hurled insults drenched not in hatred but in fear. Fear that they were still broken beyond repair. Fear that goodness was a costume they could wear only temporarily. Their ship shuddered under fire, their voices rose, and yet beneath the chaos lay a heartbeat of solidarity. for even in crisis, none considered fleeing alone. Then salvation arrived in the form of a mysterious stranger on a living planet, claiming to be Peter's father, offering answers to questions that had haunted him since childhood. The promise of belonging flickered before Peter like a flame he had longed to touch, but feared would burn him. Gamora watched him with quiet dread, sensing the danger behind perfection, because she knew better than anyone that promises too sweet often conceal poison. Rocket's jealousy surfaced, sharp and biting, masking the terror of losing the only family he'd ever allowed himself to have. Drax found in Ego's world a place where laughter came freely again, the first genuine smile since tragedy hollowed him. Baby Groot toddled through gardens, blissfully unaware of the gravity building around them. And Peter, for the first time since his mother's death, since Yondu's harsh sheltering, since the galaxy branded him outlaw, felt the intoxicating possibility that he belonged somewhere by birth, not by accident. Yet, even as Ego spoke of destiny, celestial power, immortal purpose, the glory of shaping galaxies, a darker truth pulsed beneath his words, like rot beneath gilded petals. He did not speak of love, but legacy, not family, but extension of self. And as Peter basked in the ecstasy of possibility, Gamora wandered the fields alone, fear tightening in her chest like a vice, because she recognized the hollow silence beneath Ego's smile, the same silence she heard in Thanos before he destroyed worlds. Rocket, separated from the group, wrestled with his own guilt and anger until Yondu reappeared, torn between vengeance and remorse, his Ravager code fractured but his truth solidifying. Peter was his family, not Ego. It was here, in this uncertain space between temptation and truth, that the Guardians faced their first existential fracture, not at the hands of enemies, but at the edge of their own longing. For choosing to be better is not a single act, it is a continuous war against the things inside you that refuse to let go. When the truth revealed itself, when Ego's facade crumbled into the horror of a being who saw life as clay and children as tools, Peter's fantasy collapsed under the weight of reality. The pain of losing a father twice, once by fate, once by choice, carved a wound deeper than childhood ever had. Yet this time he was not alone. Gamora stood at his side, not as a soldier but as someone who believed in him. Drax protected innocence in the form of Mantis, learning that strength could be gentle. Rocket, sobbing through anger, chose loyalty and forgiveness over fear, accepting Yondu not as rival but mentor. Groot, tiny but fierce, planted a seed of hope and a bomb at the heart of a god. And Yondu, flawed, hardened, beautiful in his broken love, made the ultimate sacrifice, proving that chosen family holds more truth than destiny ever could. The Guardians' battle against Ego was not simply a fight against a god, but a rebellion against the parts of themselves that believed they were unworthy of love, unworthy of purpose, unworthy of change. In destroying Ego, they destroyed the lie that their pain defined them. They chose to stand for each other, to protect not the galaxy's destiny, but the fragile, miraculous bond they had formed. And when Yondu died in Peter's arms, gifting him the truth his heart had starved for, he may have been your father, but he wasn't your daddy. Peter did not break. He grieved, yes, but he grieved with love, not loneliness. For the first time in his life, he knew what family meant, not perfection, not blood, but presence. And in that moment the Guardians crossed the threshold between misfits and something more powerful than any Infinity Stone could forge. They became a family, choosing each day to be better, not because they were destined to, but because they refused to be anything less ever again. Chapter 5: Children of War. Before they ever stood among heroes, before the galaxy whispered their names with reverence or fear, Gamora and Nebula lived in the shadow of a tyrant who believed himself a god, two daughters not born but claimed by Thanos, the Mad Titan, sculpted not with love but with violence, sharpened like blades rather than raised like children. And in their story lies the darkest thread of the Guardian's legacy. A reminder that sometimes the universe's cruelest weapons are not forged in metal, but in childhood itself. Gamora, last of the Zen Hoberi, was taken from a world burning beneath Thanos' armies, her mother's screams swallowed by the roar of devastation, as half her people were slaughtered in the name of balance, while Nebula was torn apart piece by piece, every defeat in combat punished with cybernetic augmentation, her flesh replaced not to heal but to humiliate, each upgrade a testament to failure, a reminder that Thanos loved Gamora more, or perhaps simply valued her more as the perfect weapon he intended her to be. From the moment he adopted them, Thanos dissolved any illusion of family, pitting them against one another in endless combat drills that were not lessons, but trials by fire, where Gamora's every victory meant Nebula's suffering, and Nebula's every scream echoed in Gamora's guilt. The Titan never raised his voice, for cruelty does not require volume, only intention, and Thanos' intention was simple: break them so completely that they could never imagine belonging anywhere but at his side, never imagine a self beyond his will. Gamora learned precision, silence, obedience forged through suppressed rage, her mind trained to calculate weakness, her body honed into the perfect assassin, yet beneath the cold discipline lingered a soul that refused to die, a flicker of compassion she buried beneath steel because to feel was to suffer. Nebula learned endurance, pain tolerance not as training but as life, every new metal limb a scar carved into her psyche, every upgrade a message that she was not enough, never enough, because she was not Gamora. And so hatred took root in her heart, hatred for Thanos, for Gamora, for herself, tangled and choking like weeds around the remnants of innocence she could never reclaim. The galaxy would one day see Gamora as the deadliest woman alive, the warrior who betrayed Thanos and stood against him. But young Gamora was a child taught that survival required silence and death, stolen from laughter and given only missions in return. Every time she drew her blade, she felt the echoes of her past humming against her pulse, knowing that she did not kill because she hated, but because she feared the consequences of failing him. The way Nebula looked at her through tears and metal, the way Thanos' cold approval wrapped around her like chains disguised as validation. And Nebula, walking through corridors dripping with alien luxury she could never feel at home in, stared into reflective metal and saw not a daughter, not a sister, but an experiment, a patchwork of grief and steel built to serve as comparison. A cruel mirror that told Gamora who she should fear becoming and told Nebula who she would never be allowed to surpass. Yet even amidst torment, they formed a bond twisted by circumstance. Gamora's guilt, a secret weight she carried, Nebula's longing for closeness buried beneath venom, their rivalry not born of hatred but of grief, two children starved of affection, forced to treat each other as enemies, because love in Thanos' realm was a myth, tenderness a punishable offense. When Gamora eventually rebelled, when she risked everything to steal the Power Stone and flee the life Thanos bound her to, it was not just an act of personal liberation. It was a betrayal that ripped open Nebula's deepest wounds. Because if Gamora could escape, then Nebula's suffering had not been fate, but sentence, a punishment that could have been avoided if she had ever been enough to be chosen too. And so Nebula's hunt for Gamora was not merely vengeance, but the desperate, furious cry of a child abandoned twice, first by the universe, then by the only person who ever mirrored her pain. When they crossed paths on the battlefield, Gamora fought with precision and remorse, Nebula with rage and sorrow, every blow between them echoing years of silent agony neither knew how to voice. Gamora tried to speak of freedom. Nebula only heard betrayal, and when their blades clashed, metal screamed not just from impact, but from the truth that love exists even in hatred, especially when it has nowhere safe to live. Their conflict unfolded across worlds, Xandar, nowhere, the fringes of space where destiny stirs, until their confrontation reached a breaking point aboard Ronan's ship, where Nebula, cornered and wounded, chose destruction over surrender, slicing off her own cybernetic limb rather than accept defeat again, and flying into the void not as a warrior triumphant but as a soul still running from pain. Gamora watched her go, heart fracturing, knowing she had won nothing but another scar. The universe did not heal their wounds quickly. Scars born in childhood do not fade in a single battle, and trauma does not bow to heroism. When the Guardians truly became a family, Gamora still flinched at intimacy, still carried distrust deep beneath her composed exterior. While Nebula roamed the galaxy with bitterness coiled around her ribs, every planet she burned through a futile attempt to cauterize a wound that could not heal until she learned the language of forgiveness. Forgiveness of Gamora, forgiveness of herself. Yet fate, or perhaps the universe's cruel mercy, forced them together again, not through combat but through shared grief. The revelation of their pasts in guarded fragments, the fragile lowering of walls, the first uncertain attempts at seeing each other not as rival, but as survivor. It was not Gamora's victory that changed Nebula. It was Gamora's apology, quiet and trembling, acknowledging that she too had been a prisoner, that she too carried guilt like weight on her spine, that she wished she could have protected Nebula, wished things had been different, wished they could rewrite childhood not as battleground but as refuge. That single moment, one sentence in a lifetime of silence, cracked Nebula's armor, and in turn, Nebula's admission, choked, bitter, broken, that she never wanted to win, she only wanted a sister, tore away the final illusions that strength in their lives had ever meant violence. They were not enemies by choice. They were proof that trauma can shape destiny, but it does not have to define it. Their reconciliation was not dramatic, not immediate. It was slow, painful, built through acts of trust carved into bone. Nebula risking herself to save Gamora. Gamora defending Nebula not as obligation but as instinct. The two of them learning, painfully, tentatively, how to stand side by side not as weapons but as women reclaiming autonomy. Thanos tried to steal from them. And then came Titan, the battlefield not just of Infinity War but of their shared history, where Thanos' shadow grew so vast it reached across space-time and ripped them apart once again. When Gamora died, sacrificed by the very man who claimed he loved her, Nebula's scream echoed across the galaxy, not the cry of a soldier but of a sister, watching the only person who understood her die at the hands of the monster who created them both. Gamora's final terror, her final resistance, her final fall into oblivion beneath a red sky on Vormir, became an open wound neither time nor vengeance could salve. She died believing she had earned her freedom, and in doing so, she left Nebula to face the universe alone, holding grief too heavy for her reconstructed body to bear. Yet Nebula survived, because she always had. And when she returned in Endgame, haunted by memories and burdened by a version of her younger self, still enslaved to Thanos, she chose not violence, not dominance, but mercy. She killed her past not to erase it, but to protect the future she had fought to build, sparing her younger self the burden of remaining under Thanos' control. It was redemption carved not in grand gestures, but in quiet strength. The strength to break a cycle that once defined her. Gamora, resurrected through time, displaced and memory stripped, returned not as the sister Nebula fought to save, but as the woman she used to be, fierce, mistrustful, hardened by war, unaware of the love she had once allowed herself to feel. And so, Nebula faced a new battle, to earn not loyalty, but connection once more, to prove that healing is not a destination, but a choice renewed every day. Their journey, unfinished and imperfect, stands as testament that family forged in pain can transform into family bound by choice. They were children of war, but they became women of will, steel not only in limb but in heart, living proof that trauma may birth monsters, but it can also forge guardians, and in the quiet spaces between battles, in glances carried across ship decks, in hands that once struck, now offered in peace, Gamora and Nebula found what Thanos tried to deny them, the right to choose who they are. And in that choice, they reshaped the universe not through conquest, but through survival, through love, reclaimed from the ashes of cruelty, through the simple, radical act of saying, I am not what he made me. I am what I choose to become. Chapter 6. The Ravager's Oath. Long before the Guardians would stand together as a family, before the galaxy whispered their names as improbable saviors, there existed a creed drifting through the lawless corners of space, whispered in the smoky dens of pirate outposts and carved into the bones of forgotten starships. The Ravager's Oath. It was not written in books, nor honored by empires, for empires feared it, and those who clung to it did so because they understood the truth. In a universe ruled by power, loyalty was rare, and honor rarer still. Staying true to the code meant living as outlaws without becoming monsters, taking without enslaving, stealing but never trafficking flesh or innocence. And though many failed to uphold its integrity, those who did were not merely bandits. They were outcasts with dignity, thieves who robbed the wicked more often than the weak, and in them an odd morality burned brighter than the stars they chased. The oath was simple, brutal, and sacred. We steal from the rich, we don't kill the innocent, and we never ever deal in children. And it was this final law, sharper than any blade, heavier than any bounty, that would divide Yondu Udonta from the only family he had before Peter Quill ever existed, casting him out from Ravager Brotherhood and into a life where he commanded respect through fear, but carried shame like a chain around his heart. For years, Yondu had drawn with Stakar Ogord and the original Ravagers, legends whose names carried weight across sectors, whose exploits became bedtime tales for rebellious youths dreaming of freedom among the stars. Stakar was not simply a captain, he was a king in exile, a man who understood that power without conscience rotted into tyranny, and Yondu had once believed the same, following him as a brother, carving his legacy beside him. But Thanos' shadow crept across every corner of the galaxy, and with it came temptation, the kind of offer even the boldest outlaw struggled to refuse, payment beyond imagination, favor with the most feared being in existence, and a job delivered with cold simplicity. Retrieve a child. Yondu accepted, believing, perhaps, that he was returning runaways, believing that the Titan, enormous, calculating, terrifying, would not lie about the children's fate. But the truth clawed at him slowly, devouring him piece by piece. None of the children he delivered ever reappeared in the cosmos. They vanished, lost not to time or adoption, but to something darker, something final. Yondu's shame fermented into secrecy. He kept the horror to himself, burying suspicion beneath silence, until one day he refused to hand over the last child on Thanos' list, and broke the cycle by choosing mercy over obedience. That child was Peter Quill, and that defiance shattered Yondu's place among Ravagers forever. The exile carved a wound deeper than any blade, Ravagers did not cast out lightly. Banishment was a fate worse than death. A sentence that stripped identity and brotherhood from a man who lived by loyalty. In that moment, Yondu lost everything, his family, his honor, his standing, leaving him lord only over those pirates reckless or desperate enough to follow him into disgrace. Even among cutthroats and thieves he stood alone, haunted by the oath he had broken and the one he now swore to keep, to never betray a child again, even if the universe believed he already had. And so, when Peter Quill came under his wing, Yondu raised him roughly, not because he lacked love, but because softness felt dangerous, because affection reminded him of the oath he failed once and refused to fail again, because protecting the boy meant hardening him to a reality Yondu knew intimately. The galaxy did not care about innocence, only survival. He told himself he kept Peter because the kid fit in small spaces and could steal with ease, but deep inside he knew truth wore a different mask. He kept him because saving one child was all he had left to make peace with the monsters he once served. Yet, while Yondu wrestled with guilt in silence, Peter grew, believing the Ravager's world was all he had, studying Yondu's every lesson, absorbing the rough code buried beneath sarcasm and brutality. Never trust easily, never give more than you can lose. Survive first, care later. It was an upbringing built on pain yet lined with hidden tenderness, shaping Peter into a rogue whose heart beat with conflicting rhythms, criminal by survival, hero by instinct, ravager by blood of experience rather than blood of birth. The Ravager's motto, "When the snare tightens, we choose each other," burrowed into him even as Yondu disguised compassion with threats. But as the Guardians emerged and Peter found belonging beyond Yondu's ship, the old captain felt his tight grasp slipping, losing the only family he had left a second time. Pride and wounds hardened him, jealousy twisting around regret. And when Peter stole the orb and fled to Xandar, Yondu bellowed rage, not because he hated the boy, but because he feared losing him the same way he lost Stakar, the same way he lost every child before Peter except this one. This one he chose to save. Meanwhile, among Ravagers across the galaxy, whispers of Yondu's sin twisted into legend. Some called him traitor, others called him coward, many called him cursed, but a few, like Kraglin, loyal, naive, hopeful, stayed, believing that beneath Yondu's steel was a man still worthy of the Ravager colors. Others resented him, chief among them Taserface, who saw Yondu's emotional weakness, his soft spot for Quill, as betrayal of pirate creed. When Ego's shadow finally bled into Yondu's life again during the events surrounding Peter's encounter with his celestial father, the Ravagers already trembled under fracture. Years of suppressed guilt, resentment, whispered mutiny, and when Rocket insulted Yondu in the prison cell aboard the Sovereign's outpost, stripping him bare with words sharper than lasers, calling out the truth that both of them hid behind anger because care terrified them. The dam broke. Taserface seized power, claiming Yondu had failed the Ravager code, not understanding that the very act he condemned was the one that saved Peter's life. The mutiny erupted with fire and betrayal, Ravager killing Ravager, a code shattered not by Yondu's defiance years prior but by ignorance and envy now. And in that chaos, the true oath revealed itself. Honor means nothing without compassion. The mutineers executed loyal crew, punished those who sided with Yondu, tortured Rocket, and mocked Groot, laughing as innocence whimpered, proving exactly why the Ravager Code existed, because pirates without principle descend into monsters. Yondu, stripped of authority, beaten and humiliated, stood face to face with the consequences of hiding his truth. But where lesser men would have begged, Yondu held dignity in his silence, because pain was not new to him, and regret had long since become familiar company. And then an unexpected thread of fate stitched itself into his story. Nebula, newly shaped by vengeance but not yet healed, freed him not out of loyalty but out of strategy, giving Yondu a second chance at redemption while chasing her own fractured path. It was Rocket, broken, snarling, fighting tears with cruelty, who finally understood Yondu because he saw himself reflected in the Ravager's weary eyes. They were two souls cut from the same wound, abandoned, feared, armored in sarcasm and violence, hiding love behind hostility because losing it hurt too much. Their escape from mutiny was not cinematic triumph. It was grief dressed in fire, a lesson in pain as Yondu executed his own men not out of vengeance but necessity. Tears buried beneath fury. Every arrow strike a eulogy for the family he lost twice over. Once for betraying the code, once for failing to defend it. When flames consumed the ship, and Yondu walked away from the blaze with Rocket at his side, the universe understood something unspoken. Redemption is not glorious. It is carved through loss, through ash, through the willingness to stand alone in the ruins of who you used to be. And later, when the Ravagers gathered to send Yondu into the stars, Ravager whistles across the void, banners of flame erupting in solemn tribute, Stakar himself acknowledging the man he once banished. The oath came full circle. Yondu had not broken the Ravager code. He had upheld it in its truest form. He had refused to deliver a child to death. He had protected the innocent, even when it cost him brotherhood. He had chosen love over loyalty to cruelty, and in doing so he became greater than any pirate legend. He became a father. His exile had never been failure. It had been sacrifice. And Peter, watching lights glitter across space like fragments of forgiveness, realized that family is not defined by origin. It is chosen, fought for, honored through action. As rockets flared and space swallowed Yondu's ashes, the Ravager's oath echoed not as law, but as legacy. You are only lost if you stop choosing to be found. Chapter 7: Ego, the Living Planet. Long before Peter Quill ever stood on unfamiliar soil and looked into the eyes of the man who called himself his father, the universe had already been shaped by a being whose ambition stretched beyond stars, and whose loneliness grew heavier than gravity itself. Ego, the living planet, a celestial born not from womb or world but from consciousness that awoke in darkness, a spark of awareness drifting through the void with no name, no companion, no meaning except what he might carve from the emptiness around him. In that moment of cosmic birth, Ego did not cry like a mortal infant, did not cling to a mother's heartbeat, did not inherit love or identity. He created himself, cell layer by cell layer, constructing a world around his core, weaving rock and soil and atmosphere into a body vast enough to eclipse moons. And in that creation, he found purpose not in existing, but in expanding, shaping, dominating, believing that life meant nothing unless he was its architect, believing that the galaxy would only have meaning once it reflected him. His consciousness stretched across landscapes and roots of stone, blooming across the surface of a planet that beat like a heart, pulsating with energy older than civilizations. And yet, even amidst such power, Ego felt the gnawing ache of isolation, a voice echoing into eternity with no answer, godhood without witness, creation without appreciation, eternity without affection. In that void of emotion, ambition twisted into obsession, and the idea of spreading himself across the universe, of planting extensions of his being on every world until all existence pulsed with his essence, took root not as madness but as destiny. But to enact such destiny, Ego needed a vessel, a child who shared his celestial spark, someone who could ignite his expansion across the stars. And so began his quest through galaxies, not for love but for legacy, not for family but for fuel, as he took mortal form to step beyond the confines of his planet, body charming beings across worlds with illusions of love, while his true purpose remained coiled beneath a smile as vast as it was false. When Ego met Meredith Quill on Earth, he found something he had not anticipated: softness, laughter, a simplicity untouched by cosmic expectations, and for a fleeting moment he allowed himself to wonder if companionship could be more than strategy, if affection could run in veins instead of neural fiber woven across planetary matter. Meredith saw him not as celestial, not as God, but as man, and in her presence Ego discovered a sensation he had never known. Not love, though he mistook it for such, but comfort, the shallow warmth of being admired without understanding, a temporary distraction from eternal emptiness. Yet when Peter was born, Ego's paternal impulse was not one of protection or joy, but evaluation. Would this child carry the spark necessary to fuel his expansion? Could this small, fragile being one day become a conduit for cosmic domination? And when he saw the spark within Peter, faint, undeveloped, but real, Ego smiled not with tenderness but with calculation. He planted tumors, not seeds of affection, killing Meredith not because he lacked feeling, but because feeling threatened him. Love, he believed, was an obstacle to purpose, and purpose was his only truth. Peter's childhood sorrow was Ego's design, and when the Ravagers stole the boy away instead of delivering him, Ego did not chase, because the cosmos was large and immortality patient. Peter would come back one day, Ego believed, because heritage pulls like gravity, and destiny, his destiny, always finds a way. Decades later, when the Sovereign's Golden Armada pursued the Guardians through space, and a mysterious ship obliterated their attackers with impossible precision, Peter saw a man step forward, not from shadows, but from legend, and the word father caught in his chest, tangled with longing and disbelief. Ego introduced himself with the ease of someone accustomed to shaping realities, his charm polished, his smile warm, his presence almost disarming, a cosmic answer to a child's lifelong question: who am I and where do I come from? Peter did not rush into his arms. Trauma does not allow such immediacy, but curiosity, hunger, and the ache of decades without belonging pulled him toward Ego's offer, to travel to his world, to learn the truth of his origin. The Milano descended into the embrace of a planet unlike any other, landscapes swirling with impossible beauty, gardens engineered from dreamlike logic, architecture growing as if breathing. Ego's world was a painting rendered in living matter, an Eden sculpted by ego and loneliness. Peter stepped upon its surface like a pilgrim returning to a sacred home he had never seen, and for a moment hope flickered inside him, fragile and radiant. Gamora, the warrior raised among stars and suffering, watched him not with jealousy but with dread, because she recognized the shimmer of seduction behind Ego's words, the ease with which charm can mask control, the way promises too perfect often conceal cages. Ego spoke of eternity, of cosmic purpose, of a universe waiting to be reborn in their image, and Peter listened not as Star-Lord, outlaw and savior, but as Peter Quill, boy who once held a Walkman like a lifeline and stared at skies he could not reach. He felt power coursing through him when Ego guided his hand to raise energy from the planet's core, celestial light pulsing in his palm like a second heartbeat, a sensation intoxicating and terrifying. For the first time he felt infinite, unbound by mortality or failure, and that taste of divinity pulled him toward a future where loss no longer existed, where pain could be erased, where his mother's absence could be replaced by cosmic purpose. But buried beneath that euphoria lay a whisper, the memory of a woman in a hospital bed, the sound of music, crackling through cheap headphones, the hand he failed to take, the ache he never escaped. Ego promised transcendence, but it was Gamora, grounded in trauma and experience, who reminded him what he would lose. Not mortality, but humanity. Not limitation, but connection. Not pain, but love. Meanwhile, Nebula, torn by her own journey of vengeance and awakening, confronted the vulnerability of family as she and Gamora battled once more, then collapsed into reluctant reconciliation among Ego's tranquil fields. Their shared wounds created bridges where blades once clashed, and in their fragile détente, Gamora confessed her fears. Something's wrong here. She did not know Ego's truth yet, but she felt it, instinct honed by a lifetime under Thanos' thumb. Predators recognize predators, and gods who demand devotion often demand more. Her unease deepened when she discovered the cavern filled with bones, the remains of Ego's failed offspring, children who lacked celestial spark and were discarded as waste, a graveyard of legacy built on sacrifice, nightmares fossilized into the soil. Gamora knew then Peter was not chosen out of love, he was selected as fuel. The revelation shattered any illusion of fatherhood Ego pretended to offer. When Peter finally learned the truth, that Ego placed the tumor in Meredith's brain, that her death wasn't a tragedy but design, the fragile fantasy he had built around belonging shattered like glass under celestial pressure. Rage rose not from heroism but from heartbreak, from the revelation that the one moment of pure love he ever knew on Earth, the warmth that shaped him before trauma hardened him, had been murdered not by fate but by the creature who now stood, calling himself family. Ego's voice turned from silk to steel, no longer wooing but commanding, his celestial form radiant and monstrous as he revealed his plan not just to reshape the universe, but to erase individuality, identity, free will. All life would become Ego, all worlds mere extensions of his consciousness. Peter, blinded briefly by the power coursing through him, weighed immortality against meaning and found eternity hollow. What value is a universe without laughter, without pain that shapes compassion, without the messy fragility that makes existence beautiful? Ego offered godhood, but Peter remembered humanity, remembered friends forged in trauma, remembered Groot's sacrifice, Rocket's tears, Gamora's quiet hope, Drax's laughter cracked by grief, Yondu's final embrace. He chose imperfection over infinity. The battle that followed was chaos infused with grief, cosmic energy colliding with mortal determination, Ego shifting forms and unleashing celestial fury, while Peter, fueled by raw emotion, punched him not as a god, but as a son betrayed. Rocket, fighting alongside him, built the bomb that would strike Ego's core, delivering the fatal blow through the smallest warrior, baby Groot, brave and innocent, planting destruction where creation had run rampant. Drax protected Mantis, whose gentle power calmed planets yet trembled before abuse. Nebula fought not to kill Gamora but to save her. They did not fight like soldiers obeying orders. They fought like family refusing to lose one another. And in the end, as Ego crumbled and the planet body imploded, Peter lost his celestial spark, immortality flickering out like a candle smothered by wind, and found something far greater, the certainty that family is not written in blood or birthed in cosmic design, but forged in choice. He lost the power of a god and gained the clarity of a man. Yondu's arrival at that moment, saving Peter from the collapsing planet, sealed the truth Ego could never comprehend. Fatherhood is not creation, it is sacrifice. He may have been your father, boy, but he wasn't your daddy, Yondu whispered, as life left him, and in that final breath the universe rebalanced, not through celestial expansion, but through human connection. Ego, the living planet, faded into stardust, devoured by the void that once birthed him, while a ravager's funeral lit the cosmos with fireworks of honor, grieving a man who chose love over power, compassion over destiny. Ego died believing the universe should become him. Peter lived knowing the universe mattered because it was not him. In destroying Ego, the Guardians destroyed the lie that lineage defines destiny. They proved that even children of gods can choose humanity over divinity, and that in the quiet space between star fields, the most powerful force is not cosmic expansion, but the imperfect, fragile, beautiful act of belonging. Chapter 8: A Funeral of Sparks and Stars. There are deaths that shake galaxies, deaths that end dynasties, deaths sung by prophets and carved into monuments of stone. And then there are deaths that happen in silence, in the fragile breath between a father's final words and a son's first realization that he is suddenly alone in the universe. And it was this quieter kind of loss, not cosmic but human, that echoed across the stars when Yondu Udonta, Ravager and exile and unlikely guardian, gave his life to save Peter Quill. His passing did not ripple outward in shockwaves of destruction, like the fall of Ego, did not tear veils in the fabric of reality, like the snap that would one day follow. Yet, for the Guardians, for Peter, Rocket, Gamora, Drax, Groot, and even Nebula, watching from the edge of grief she could not yet name, it felt as if the galaxy itself had forgotten how to breathe. When Peter held Yondu in his arms amid the ruins of Ego's collapsing world, the heat of celestial fire fading against the cold of encroaching space, time did not pause out of reverence. It fractured, pulled apart by the weight of everything unsaid, every harsh word that had disguised love, every insult that had been armor against tenderness neither of them knew how to express. Peter, who once believed himself abandoned, stolen, cheated of childhood, now faced the truth carved into Yondu's final breath. He had not been taken, he had been saved, and the boy who spent his life calling himself orphan discovered that parenthood is not defined by who gives you life, but who gives their life for you. Yondu's hand touched Peter's cheek, not with the strength of the warrior who once commanded fear, but with the gentleness of a man who finally allowed himself to love without disguise. And in that touch lay decades of emotion compressed into seconds: apology, forgiveness, pride, regret, and a quiet gratitude that he had, in the end, been able to do one thing right. The vacuum stole his words before he could speak them again, and as the last spark of life faded from his eyes, the universe did not roar. It whispered as if afraid to disturb the sanctity of a heartbreak too intimate for myth. When the Guardians returned to space with Yondu's body, grief sat with them like a new crew member, heavy and silent. Peter did not speak at first, not out of stoicism, but because sorrow felt unfamiliar, raw, unlike the grief he carried for his mother, which had calcified over years into scar tissue he mistook for strength. This grief was different, sharper, more immediate, filled not with loneliness but love, and love, to someone who spent his life fearing abandonment, felt like both blessing and wound. Rocket, who pretended tears were just static on his circuits, could not escape the reflection staring back at him. Yondu was him, older, worn, hardened by suffering, but softened by love in the end. and the realization carved its way through Rocket's chest like a blade. Drax, who once believed vengeance the only language he understood, placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, not to comfort but to share weight. He knew loss, and loss unshared becomes a tomb, and he would not allow his friend to be buried alone. Gamora sat quietly beside Peter, her presence not consolation but anchor, knowing that to speak too soon would be to disrupt a grief still forming shape, and she offered instead her stillness, which in its own way was love. Groot, small and fragile, clung to Rocket's leg and looked at Yondu's body with the wide-eyed sorrow only innocence can hold, whispering quietly a soft, "I am Groot," a phrase so simple yet so profound that it carried more grief than poetry could ever accomplish. Nebula stood apart, arms crossed, face stoic, but her gaze lingered on Yondu not with detachment, but with the recognition of a truth she could not yet say aloud. He had spared her, shown mercy, fought for what she still struggled to understand. Family born from choice, not fear. And then came the question, would the Ravagers honor Yondu? Would they return for a man exiled from their ranks, condemned for breaking the oath they held sacred? Would they see him now not as traitor but as hero? Ravagers do not give funerals lightly. Theirs is a send-off earned, not gifted, a ritual of fire and light, reserved for captains who live by a code deeper than law, a code that says loyalty is not obedience but sacrifice, that honor is not in reputation but in the choices one makes when no one is watching. Peter feared they would not come, feared Yondu would pass into eternity, unacknowledged by the only brotherhood he ever knew, and in that fear lay the last remnants of the boy who once felt unwanted by every world he touched. But as the Milano drifted in stillness, a silence broke across the void. Not sound, but presence, ships emerging from hyperspace one by one, their engines humming like distant hymns. Ravagers from across sectors appeared, ships adorned with banners, ships bearing scars from old battles, fought side by side with Yondu, ships belonging to captains who had once judged him, hated him, exiled him, now arriving to honor him. Stakar Ogord himself led the procession, his ship gliding forward like a king's paying penance to a fallen knight. He did not speak at first, because words in the face of redemption are clumsy things, and there are moments when silence is the only language worthy of grief. The Ravager funeral ceremony began not with trumpets or chants, but with a single flare shot into the void, a streak of fire against the black canvas of space, signifying acknowledgement. And then came the lights, dozens, then hundreds, each ship releasing a cascade of firework stars that drifted around Yondu's body like constellations, forming in real time, each color a memory, each spark a confession. We judged you, we cast you out, we misunderstood you, but now we see you. It was not forgiveness, forgiveness implies wrong, it was recognition. Recognition that Yondu had honored the code in the most sacred way possible, by breaking it for the sake of a child, that he had paid with exile, pain, and life itself to uphold the true meaning of the Ravager's creed. Peter watched as the sky burned with tribute, tears falling not because he mourned alone, but because he realized grieving together was its own kind of freedom. For so long he had feared vulnerability, feared that love led only to loss, that opening himself meant surrendering control. But here, in this impossible symphony of fire and starlight, he understood that grief shared is proof that love existed, and love existing was no weakness at all. The Ravagers whistled, not in command, not in threat, but in mourning, their whistles rising in haunting harmony, calling Yondu home in the only way they knew. And as his body ignited, flames curling around him like final armor, Peter placed the last gift in his hands. The arrow Yondu wielded with lethal grace but always in protection, a symbol of power, tied not to force but to conviction. Rocket handed Peter a new prototype fin, crafted through tears he'd never admit to shedding, honoring Yondu not just as fallen Ravager but as the father he recognized in himself, a man who hid love behind rough edges, who learned too late how to show it, but showed it nonetheless. When Peter activated the fin, sending the arrow flying in silent salute, the entire galaxy felt smaller, not because Yondu left it, but because his absence revealed spaces once filled by his presence, spaces carved not by blood but by bond. As fireworks cried across the nebula, Drax whispered that Yondu was now among the stars, maybe with those he loved, maybe with those he wished he had treated better. A simple move from a man who had once believed strength came only from destruction, now learning that vulnerability was not surrender but evolution. Gamora touched Peter's hand, not to console, but to connect, offering a quiet reminder that grief does not devour forever, that hearts broken feel stronger. Nebula, unable to remain distant any longer, approached and stood beside them, not asking to join, simply joining. This family does not require permission, only presence. Groot reached out, leaves trembling, and Rocket rested a hand upon the tiny sapling body, whispering to Yondu's memory not in words but in breath, acknowledging a soul who saw him when he didn't want to be seen. And Peter, Star-Lord, Thief, Hero, Sun, inhaled the sight before him, a sky burning with farewell, a legacy rising from ashes brighter than any celestial promise Ego ever offered. Yondu's death did not grant Peter closure. Closure is a myth, a fantasy for those who fear feeling, but it granted him truth. That pain is not proof of weakness, that loss is the price of connection, that fatherhood is measured in moments of sacrifice, not years of presence. Peter's eyes filled with tears. He didn't hide because to hide would dishonor the man who taught him that running is not strength, that facing hurt is sometimes the bravest act of all. And as the last spark faded and space returned to quiet, Peter whispered a farewell, not filled with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude for a man he once resented and now revered. Gratitude for a childhood saved by rough hands that never let him fall. Gratitude that love can exist even in broken places, can bloom in soil hardened by survival. When the Ravagers departed, leaving trails of starlight like blessings behind them, the Milano hummed with a new energy, an emptiness tempered by resolve. Yondu's absence did not weaken the Guardians, it refined them, binding them not through necessity but through choice, through understanding that family forged by struggle and sacrifice is stronger than blood and destiny. Peter placed his Walkman on the console, clicked play, and as music filled the ship, a melody soft and aching and eternal, the Guardians sat together not as warriors preparing for battle, but as souls breathing the same grief, sharing, honoring. For in the end, the funeral of sparks and stars was not farewell. It was promise. A promise to carry Yondu's legacy not in mourning, but in action. To live by a code shaped not by perfection, but by love, imperfect and fierce. The galaxy moved on, unaware of the quiet revolution in one ship's heart. But the Guardians would never be the same, and neither would the universe, because when a man like Yondu Udonta dies, he does not vanish. He becomes something greater, living on not in legend or fear, but in every choice made by those he saved. He became starlight, and in the vast silence of space, starlight is eternal.